Settle in, wherever you are tonight, and let yourself grow still, because the story we are beginning together is a long and beautiful one, and there is no hurry at all, no hurry whatsoever, only the quiet unfolding of a life that changed the world not with swords or armies, but with words, with the careful and luminous arrangement of words, and we have all the time in the night to find our way into it slowly. If you find comfort in these stories, and you want to be able to find your way back to them night after night, you might consider subscribing, so that this little corner of the night is always there waiting for you when you need it. And if you feel like it, before you drift away, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Because there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that somewhere in Australia, somewhere in Canada, somewhere in a small apartment in a city that never quite goes dark, another person is lying in the same kind of stillness, letting the same ancient world wash gently over them, and that community of sleepless listeners is a tender thing worth knowing about. But now, let us begin. Imagine a morning in early autumn, in the hills of central Italy, in the time before the world had settled into the shape we now call history. The air is cool and carries the faint mineral scent of stone that has been warming in the sun all summer and is only now beginning to release its heat, slowly, reluctantly, the way old things relinquish warmth. Below the hills, the river Fibrinus moves over its smooth, pale bed with a sound that is less a rush than a murmur, a patient, continuous sound that has been there longer than anyone in the town above can remember, longer than the oldest olive tree on the hillside, longer than the road that winds down from the ridge and disappears into the soft haze of the lowlands. The town is Arpinum, and in the 106th year before the birth of Christ, in the early days of January, a child was born there who would one day be given the name Marcus Tullius Cicero. Though none of the people in that small hill town on that cold winter morning could have known what that name would eventually mean to the world. Arpinum sits on high ground, as so many of the old hill towns of central Italy do, and the reason for this is simple and ancient, the same reason that birds nest in the tops of trees and cats sleep on windowsills, which is that height offers safety, and the people of Arpinum had learned over many generations to love the feeling of the land falling away beneath them, the sense of being held above the ordinary world. The streets of the town were narrow and paved with irregular stone, and in winter they were cold enough that your breath hung in small clouds before you, and in summer they were sun-warmed from before dawn until long after the evening meal, holding the heat in the way that only stone can, deep and slow and steady. The family into which Cicero was born was not an aristocratic one, at least not in the sense that Rome would have understood aristocracy, not a family of senators or consuls, not a family whose name was carved into the great monuments of the city. They were instead what the Romans called equestrians, members of the second order of Roman society, men of property and standing, men who could afford horses and education and the long view of things, men whose ambitions were real and whose resources were sufficient to pursue them, but who had not yet, in this particular branch of the family, climbed the final steep steps into the senatorial class. It is said that the family had been settled in the Arpinum region for several generations, and that they owned land in the hills and along the river valley, and that they were respected in the way that old families in small towns are always respected, for their continuity, if nothing else, for the simple reassuring fact of still being there. The land around Arpinum in those days would have been deeply familiar to anyone who has ever walked the Italian countryside in autumn, when the harvest is done and the fields are showing the soft brown of turned earth between the remaining green, when the oak trees on the hillsides are beginning to turn copper at the edges, and the light comes in at a lower angle and makes everything look slightly gilded, slightly more itself than it is at other times of year. There were pastures on the gentler slopes, and gardens closer to the houses, and along the river there were groves of poplar and willow, whose leaves moved constantly even when there seemed to be no wind, as if the trees were carrying on a private, continuous conversation with the water below them. The sound of water was something Cicero would know from his earliest days, the sound of the Fibrinus and the Liris joining below the town. Two rivers coming together in the particular way that rivers have, not dramatically, not with any sudden violence, but with a kind of gradual merging, the currents braiding and unbraiding, the colors of the two streams slowly becoming one color, and the sound settling into a single continuous voice, that could be heard on quiet mornings from the streets of the town above. It is a sound that asks nothing of you, the sound of moving water. It simply continues, and if you listen to it long enough, it begins to feel like a kind of breathing, slow and reliable, and you can let your own breath fall into the same rhythm, without even noticing that you have done so. In later years, when Cicero had become famous and had built for himself a beautiful villa at Tusculum in the hills above Rome, he would sometimes write about Arpinum with a tenderness that surprised even him, the way homesickness can catch you off guard, even when you are standing in a place more beautiful than the one you left. He called it his fatherland, his patria, the place where the roots of himself went deepest into the ground, and the story goes that he spent time there whenever the pressures of Rome became too heavy to carry easily, sitting by the rivers and thinking, letting the old familiar water sound reorganize his thoughts into something more manageable. The world of late Republican Italy, in the years of Cicero's childhood, was one of extraordinary energy and equally extraordinary anxiety. Rome had grown over the preceding centuries from a city into an empire, though, in those days, the word empire did not yet carry quite the meaning it would later carry, and the Republic, with its consuls and its senate and its elaborate system of laws and traditions, was still the form through which Romans understood themselves and their place in the world. But there were cracks, invisible to most people most of the time, the way cracks in old stone are invisible until the morning, when they suddenly are not. And the generation into which Cicero was born was one that would spend its entire life navigating those cracks, trying to hold something together that had already, in some deep and structural sense, begun to come apart. None of this was visible yet from the hills of Arpinum. From the hills of Arpinum, the world was the width of the valley and the height of the ridge, and the most urgent questions of the morning were the questions of weather and harvest and the kind of small social negotiations that fill the days of people who have lived near each other for a long time. The boy who would become Cicero grew up in this world first, before he grew up into the larger one, and perhaps that is why, even at the height of his fame, even when he was standing in the great forums of Rome, speaking to thousands of people, there was something in him that still understood the scale of a river valley, the way a single voice sounds in the early morning air, the patience required to wait for water to pass. The oil lamp burns low in the quiet hour of night, and the hills of Arpinum are dark now, the river still moving below them in its unhurried way, and the child who will become one of the most remarkable minds of the ancient world is sleeping somewhere in all of that darkness, not yet anything more than a child, not yet a lawyer or a philosopher or a senator or an exile, just a child in a hill town at the edge of a world that is very slowly beginning to change. Rest here for a moment in these hills, in this gentle darkness, in the sound of the two rivers finding each other below the town, because tomorrow we will follow young Marcus down from the hills and into the world of his education, and the story will begin to open up like a road stretching out before you in the early light, but there is no need to walk it yet. Let the water carry you quietly into sleep. The smell of wood smoke and morning bread comes first, drifting through the low corridors of a Roman household before the sun has properly cleared the hills, and it is into a world of such ordinary, quiet comforts that the boy Marcus Tullius Cicero woke each day in the town of Arpinum, in the rolling green country of the Volscian highlands, in the final turning decades of the 2nd century before the birth of Christ. He was not a boy of the great families. That is worth holding gently in mind, because it shaped everything, every ambition that would later burn in him, every careful word chosen to convince men who considered themselves his betters by birthright alone. His father, also named Marcus, belonged to the equestrian order, that broad and respectable middle tier of Roman society that lived comfortably but stood always one rung below the senatorial aristocracy, able to see the summit of Roman life clearly enough to know its contours, but rarely permitted to climb it. The family owned land, kept a good house, maintained the kind of modest dignity that asked nothing flashy of the world, but gave its children a solid floor to stand upon. And upon that floor, young Marcus stood very still sometimes, listening. It is said that he listened in a way that other children did not, that he absorbed the rhythms of adult speech with an attention that was almost uncanny, turning words over in his mind, the way a river turns smooth a rough stone, patiently, ceaselessly, until something polished and precise remained. His younger brother Quintus was a steady, affectionate companion through these early years, and the two boys would have moved through the familiar geography of their childhood together. The slopes above the town, the cold, clear river Fibrinus, with its reeds and its light, the fields their father managed, the narrow roads between farms, where the sounds of oxen and birdsong braided themselves together in the warm Italian afternoons. Their father was a man of genuine intellectual seriousness, which in a household of the equestrian order was itself a kind of statement of intent. He was not well enough physically to pursue a political career, the ancient sources tell us, and so he poured what might have been civic ambition into something quieter and perhaps more lasting, the education of his sons. He understood, it seems, that in Rome, the road to any kind of greatness for a man not born to ancient senatorial prestige ran through the mind and the voice. It ran through Greek and through rhetoric and through the careful study of law and philosophy, and so he opened that road as wide as he could. Greek came early to young Marcus, as it did to any child of serious Roman aspiration in this period, and it came not as a foreign thing, reluctantly learned, but as a second dwelling place that the boy moved into with ease and evident pleasure. The Greek language carried with it an entire world of thought, the dialogues of Plato, the ethics of Aristotle, the poetry of Homer and Hesiod, the great flowering of Athenian intellectual life that Rome both admired and measured itself against. To read Greek well was to gain access to the deepest storerooms of human reflection that the ancient world had yet assembled, and Marcus, it appears, walked into those storerooms very young and was in no hurry to leave. There was also poetry in Latin, and the boy turned naturally toward it. He composed verses, the story goes, and while the verses of a child are rarely remembered by history, what they suggest is a mind already alert to the music that language could make, the way a line could be shaped so that it fell not just meaningfully, but beautifully upon the ear. This sensitivity to sound and rhythm was not incidental to the orator Cicero would become. It was foundational, the earliest thread of what would eventually become the most celebrated prose style in the Latin language. But Arpinum, however beloved, was not Rome, and a Roman education of serious ambition required Rome. And so the family made the journey, sometime in Cicero's boyhood, relocating at least seasonally to the city, so that Marcus and his brother might study properly, sit at the feet of proper teachers, and begin to absorb the immense, complicated, endlessly layered world of the capital. The road from Arpinum to Rome ran roughly southeast to northwest through the Apennine foothills, and out onto the great flat expanse of the Campagna, that wide agricultural plain that spread itself before the city, like a brown and gold blanket in the months of harvest. The journey was measured in days, not hours, and for a boy arriving for perhaps the first time with real comprehension, the moment when Rome began to show itself, the roads thickening with traffic, the carts and the mules and the merchants, the distant sounds multiplying into something that could only be called noise on a scale the hills had never offered, must have been a reshaping of the imagination. In Rome, the father arranged for his sons to study alongside the children of better families, and this too was deliberate, because in Rome the networks formed in childhood could sustain or thwart a career for decades. Among Marcus's early companions was a boy named Titus Pomponius, who would grow into the man history knows as Atticus. The dearest, most faithful friend of Cicero's entire life, the one to whom many of his most intimate letters would later be written, the quiet constant in a life of turbulent public noise. That the two boys found each other early, that they recognized in one another some shared quality of mind and temperament, is one of those small accidents of proximity that history occasionally permits to be tender. Their teachers in Rome were men of genuine distinction. One such figure was Lucius Aelius Stylo, a scholar of Latin language and literature, who had devoted himself to the study of early Roman texts with the kind of loving precision that only true devotion to a subject produces. To study with such a man was to understand that words were not merely tools but artifacts, that the Latin language had a history worth knowing and a depth worth sounding. Marcus absorbed this too, added it to his Greek, let the two traditions sit together in the capacious rooms of his developing mind, and slowly begin their long conversation. The law came next, in its proper place, introduced through the practice of attending on a distinguished jurist named Quintus Mucius Scaevola, the augur, an old and highly respected man whose household a young Roman of good family might attend in order to observe how legal questions were handled, how disputes were framed and resolved, how the accumulated body of Roman legal reasoning could be brought to bear on the complicated tangles of human life. This was not a formal classroom, but something more like an apprenticeship of presence. You watched and listened, and if you were fortunate and attentive, you began to understand how a trained mind moved through a problem, how it separated what was essential from what was merely loud. And Marcus was always listening. His teachers noticed it. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but long repeated, that the boys who studied alongside him would carry home news to their parents of how quick the young Arpinum boy was, how he seemed to grasp a thing not just intellectually but wholly, the way a hand closes around an object and knows its weight and texture simultaneously. Whether or not the story is precisely true, it reflects something that multiple ancient sources agree upon, that the intelligence of the young Cicero was visible and remarkable, and that it was recognized early. What it felt like to be that boy is harder to say. There must have been loneliness in it, the particular loneliness of a mind that moves more quickly than the conversations around it, that finds itself waiting, slightly, while the world catches up. There must also have been a corresponding anxiety. Cicero would carry anxiety with him all his life, a companion as faithful as Atticus, the worry that what he had might not be enough, that the gap between equestrian and senator was too wide for mere talent to bridge. But alongside the anxiety, there was clearly something else, something that burned steadily and quietly in the years of his boyhood, like the small oil lamps that filled Roman houses with their warm, unsteady light, a sense that words were power, that a voice trained and shaped and given the right words at the right moment could do what swords and silver and ancient names could do, and perhaps do it more lastingly. He was a boy in a city that did not yet know his name, walking the streets of Rome with his brother and his friend Atticus, already storing everything, already listening with that quality of attention that would one day astonish senators and terrify men who had never expected to be afraid of another man's sentences. And those streets themselves, the streets he was beginning to learn the feel of underfoot, their smells and their sounds, their morning shadows and their evening warmth, the stone and the smoke and the lamplight pooling at the doorways of the houses at dusk, those streets deserve, in time, a longer look of their own, an unhurried wander through the city that was becoming his world, before we follow him deeper into it. For now, let the boy sleep, as boys eventually do, with Latin and Greek still murmuring somewhere behind his closed eyes, and the small flame of the household lamp burning low in another room, patient and still. The light is going out of the sky above Rome. It happens slowly, the way most beautiful things happen, without announcing itself, without asking permission, the sun pulling its warmth back from the 7 hills, as though gathering something precious into its arms, before the long night begins. The western horizon, visible in glimpses between the crowded rooflines of the Aventine, holds its color for a long time, first a deep and burning amber, then something softer, a rose the color of old terracotta, and finally a blue that is neither quite day nor quite night, settling like still water over the whole enormous, breathing, improbable city. This is Rome, in the final century of the Republic, on an evening very much like 10,000 other evenings, and yet utterly singular, as all evenings are. The smoke rises first. It is always the smoke you notice before anything else, rising from the bakehouses and the small charcoal braziers of the street vendors, from the thermopolia, where hot food is ladled into terracotta bowls for those who have no kitchen of their own. And in a city of this size, crowded into its valleys and climbing its hills, in great stacks of timber-framed insulae, most people have no kitchen of their own, or nothing more than a small clay pot balanced over a handful of coals. The smoke mingles with the smell of bread and roasting meat and the sharp animal heaviness of the streets themselves, which have been walked by hundreds of thousands of feet since before the sun was up, and which hold the memory of all that passage in their stones. Rome smells of itself in a way no description can entirely capture. It is a living smell, rich and complicated, not always pleasant, always vivid, always unmistakably the smell of a city that has never quite stopped growing. The streets are narrow in most places, far narrower than you might expect of the city that governed half the known world. Between the tall apartment buildings, the insulae rising 3 and 4 and sometimes 5 stories into the evening air, there is often barely enough room for 2 people to pass without turning sideways. The stones underfoot are large and smooth and slightly rounded from generations of wear, and between them run the shallow channels meant to carry rainwater, though in the dry months of summer they carry other things instead. The stepping stones, those raised flat blocks placed at intervals across the wider streets, have grown shiny and gray with use, and the children of the neighborhood know exactly how to leap between them without thinking, without breaking stride. Now, as the dusk settles in, the character of the streets is changing. During the hours of daylight, Roman law forbade most wheeled traffic within the city, a concession to the impossible noise and congestion that carts would otherwise create. And so, the days belonged to people, to the long-robed citizens moving toward the forum, to the slaves carrying parcels and messages and their masters' burdens, to the vendors calling out in voices roughened by years of open-air commerce. But as darkness comes, the carts begin to appear. You can hear them before you see them, the heavy wooden wheels grinding against the paving stones, the creak and groan of axles, the occasional sharp complaint of a mule. The deliveries of the night are the foundations of the day, grain and wine and timber and marble and all the thousand things a city of perhaps 1,000,000 souls requires to keep breathing from one morning to the next. In the Forum, the great open heart of Roman public life, the last of the day's business is being concluded. The Forum is quieter now than it was at midday, when it was so crowded that movement was almost impossible, when the voices of advocates and merchants and idlers and philosophers all blended into a single roar that could be heard from the tops of the surrounding hills. Now there are only small clusters of men still talking, still gesturing, still making the arguments and counter-arguments that are the constant music of Roman civic life. The columns of the temples catch the last of the light along their western faces and glow almost golden for a few long minutes. And then the shadow comes, and they return to their habitual white and gray. The temples are everywhere in Rome, tucked into unexpected corners, rising above the rooflines of ordinary buildings, standing in their own precincts behind low walls where priests move quietly in the gathering dark. The great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill anchors the whole city in something older than law, older than the Republic itself. It can be seen from almost any point of high ground, and it catches the last light of evening as though it were designed precisely for this purpose, which perhaps it was. The priests are making their evening offerings now, small fires and the smell of incense drifting out through the open doors, and a few late worshippers pause on the steps with their heads bowed, doing whatever it is that people do when they need the gods to pay attention. Below the Capitoline, along the edge of the Forum, the Basilica Aemilia is closing its shutters on the day's business. This is where much of Rome's commercial life is transacted, under a long covered hall of considerable beauty, a sound of money and agreements and disputes bouncing off the high ceiling throughout the daylight hours. Now the last of the bankers and merchants are wrapping their tallies and gathering their wax tablets, tucking them under their arms with the slightly distracted air of men whose minds are still adding columns of figures, even as their feet carry them home. Down toward the river, the Tiber is taking on its evening color, that particular gray-green that the river favors in low light, moving with what appears to be great patience toward the sea, carrying along its surface the small debris of a city's day, a floating scrap of cloth, a bruised fig, the occasional torch-reflected glimmer. The docks along the Tiber's bank are still active, will remain active well into the night, because grain barges do not observe convenient hours. The men who work the river are built like the work itself, broad, deliberate, patient with heavy things. They speak in low voices and take their wine from a shared jar without ceremony. In the alleyways radiating out from the Forum and the markets, the tabernae are coming into their fullest life. These are the taverns and wine shops of Rome, narrow-fronted, open to the street, with their amphorae of wine propped at angles along the counter, and the proprietor leaning on his elbows in a posture that suggests he has been leaning on those same elbows for 30 years and intends to continue. The light inside the tabernae comes from oil lamps, small clay vessels with their wicks trailing in the oil, and they give the interior a warm and wavering amber glow that makes everything look slightly softer than it is. The conversation in these places is loud and overlapping, full of the politics and gossip and complaint that are the unofficial business of Rome. Who has won a case, who has lost money, what the general in the East is rumored to be doing, whether the price of grain is going up again, whether the consul is a fool, whether the man 3 stools down cheated at dice. The wealthy parts of the city have their own evening quality. On the Palatine Hill, where the great houses of Rome's oldest families stand behind their high walls, the streets are quieter, the paving cleaner, the sounds more muffled. Lamplight glows at the high windows, and occasionally you catch, passing by a garden gate, the smell of something green and well-watered, a garden breathing out its last warmth into the cooling air. Slaves move on silent errands between the houses. A litter passes, borne on the shoulders of 6 men, the curtains drawn, and somewhere in this enormous, layered, contradictory city, in one of its schools, in one of its colonnaded walkways, where teachers walked with students in the old Greek manner, or in the house of some advocate or senator willing to receive a talented boy from the hill towns, a young man from Arpinum is beginning to find the shape of the world he has entered. He is listening, as he always listens, with an attention so complete it is almost physical. He is hearing the city in all its registers, its arguments and its silences, its great formal speeches and its tavern grumbling, the polished Latin of the courts and the rough street Latin of the markets. He is learning that language has texture and temperature and weight. The lamps of Rome are lit now, small flames scattered across the dark hills like stars that have decided to settle, and the city murmurs on into the night. Tomorrow there will be more learning, more listening, more of the long, slow work of becoming. But that is tomorrow, and this evening rests easy, unhurried, warm with lamplight and the smell of smoke rising into the dark. The oil lamp in the corner of the small study had been burning for hours, its flame barely trembling in the still air, casting a warm amber circle across the papyrus rolls stacked carefully along the wall, and the young man bent over them, reading, always reading, his lips moving faintly as though tasting the words before allowing them to settle somewhere deeper inside him. This was how Marcus Tullius Cicero spent the better part of his early years in Rome, not in the forums yet, not in the courts, not before any crowd that might applaud or condemn him, but here, in the quiet company of masters both living and long dead, absorbing everything he could find, as though he understood instinctively that the voice he wished one day to possess could only be built slowly, the way a stone wall is built, one carefully chosen piece resting upon another. He had arrived in Rome as a boy, still young enough to be homesick for the green hills of Arpinum, and yet ambitious enough to feel the pull of the city like a hand at his collar. His father, a man of equestrian rank and considerable literary taste, had made arrangements that many Roman fathers of means made for sons of promise. He had placed young Marcus in the household of the great Lucius Licinius Crassus, the finest orator of that generation, so that the boy might breathe the same air as greatness and learn through proximity as much as instruction what excellence in public speech actually looked like when it moved through a room. It is said that Cicero sat and listened to Crassus with an attention so focused and so still that the older man noticed him, and that noticing was itself a kind of education, the recognition of one sharp mind by another across the quiet distance of a Roman atrium, from Crassus and from the orator Marcus Antonius, grandfather of the man who would one day figure so dramatically in Cicero's final years, though no one in that tranquil study could have known it. Cicero absorbed the essential rhythms of Roman rhetoric, the way a well-made sentence rises and gathers weight before releasing itself, the way silence, placed correctly, can strike harder than any word. But he was never content with only one teacher, never satisfied with only one tradition, and this restlessness of mind, this hunger to find what was best in every school of thought and weave it into something that was entirely his own, would become perhaps the most defining quality of his intellectual life. The Greek philosophers had been flowing into Rome for generations by then, their ideas arriving like goods on trading ships from the eastern Mediterranean, welcomed by some, regarded with suspicion by others, but increasingly impossible to ignore. Cicero threw himself into their world with an eagerness that some of his more traditionally minded contemporaries may have found excessive. He studied under the Epicurean philosopher Phaedrus, whose gentle, measured way of speaking about pleasure and tranquility left its mark even on a mind that would ultimately find a different philosophical home. He sat with Diodotus the Stoic, who it is said lived for many years in the Cicero family home itself, a quiet and learned presence moving through the corridors, and under whose patient instruction young Marcus studied not only philosophy, but also the demanding discipline of arguing without gesture, without the support of a body that could lean forward to suggest urgency or step back to invite reflection. Only the voice, only the logic, only the unadorned structure of thought. It was a rigorous and perhaps humbling exercise for a young man who would later become famous for the expressiveness of his entire self when he spoke. But the foundation it laid in pure reasoning was something he would draw upon for the rest of his life. He was also, during these years, placing his extraordinary memory in service of language itself, filling himself with Greek poetry and drama, the way one might fill a cellar with wine, not for immediate use but for the slow, unconscious richness it would lend to everything that came after. He translated Homer, he translated Aratus, the Greek astronomical poet, turning the movement of stars and constellations into Latin verse with a facility that astonished those who read it. The act of translation, he would later write, was itself a form of education unlike any other, because it required you to understand not merely what a writer had said, but how they had thought, what choices they had made, and what alternatives they had set aside, and in that understanding lay something close to the secret of how language actually works. But there came a moment, somewhere in his middle 20s, when the accumulated intensity of all this study, all this reading and arguing and translating and memorizing, began to take a toll on the body that housed such a restless mind. His voice, it is recorded, was at this early period strained and overextended. He spoke with too much force, too much eagerness, driving his words out with a physical urgency that exhausted him, and sometimes alarmed those who listened. His physicians and his friends advised him to rest, to travel, to step away from the Roman courts where he had already begun to appear, and which we shall hear more about very soon. And so, in the year that fell roughly 80 years before the birth of Christ, the young Cicero sailed east into the warm and ancient world of Greece and Asia Minor, and everything that followed on that journey would shape him as profoundly as any teacher he had ever sat before. Athens received him like a city that has always known it holds something irreplaceable, its streets worn smooth by centuries of philosophers and their students, its air carrying the faint smell of the sea and of stone warmed by the afternoon sun. Cicero walked where Plato had walked. He stood near the place where Socrates had spoken, and then fallen silent forever. He enrolled himself in the academy under Antiochus of Ascalon, a philosopher of the school that traced its lineage back through the centuries to Plato himself, and here he found something that resonated more deeply than anything he had encountered before, a philosophy that did not demand he abandon the world and retire to pure contemplation, but one that asked him to engage with the world, to seek virtue in action, to understand that the good life and the life of service to one's community were not in conflict, but were in fact expressions of the same underlying truth. This was the philosophical home he had been looking for, and he recognized it with the quiet release of a traveler who has been walking for a long time and suddenly sees through the trees the lights of a house. From Athens he traveled further, to Asia Minor, where he absorbed the florid, elaborate style of the Asian rhetoricians, a style very different from the spare Attic tradition, richer in ornament and emotional color, the sort of oratory that moved crowds the way music moves them, through feeling as much as argument. He did not adopt this style whole, but he listened to it carefully, the way a craftsman examines a tool he may not use himself, but whose principles he wishes to understand. And then, finally, he came to Rhodes, to the school of Molon of Rhodes, and here something decisive happened. Molon was considered among the finest teachers of rhetoric then living. A man who had already taught in Rome and had already, it is said, encountered the young Cicero there. But it was in Rhodes, away from the noise of Roman ambition, with the salt wind moving off the Aegean and the lamp burning low in the evenings after long days of instruction, that Molon did something invaluable for his student. He took the brilliance that was already there, unmistakable and almost overwhelming in its energy, and he shaped it. He taught Cicero to hold something back, to trust the listener, to understand that restraint is not weakness, but a form of power, that a river contained by banks moves faster and further than water spilled across open ground. The story goes that when Molon heard Cicero declaim for the first time in Rhodes, he wept, and when asked why, said that it pained him to think that Greece might lose to Rome even the one remaining thing that had been hers alone, the glory of eloquence. Whether or not those precise words were spoken on that particular evening, the feeling behind them seems true, and it lingers, gentle as the sound of water against harbor stone. Cicero sailed home from Rhodes a different man than the one who had left, not changed in nature, but refined, the way raw metal becomes something finer and more useful after it has passed through the necessary heat. His voice was steadier now, his health restored, his mind supplied with philosophy and poetry and argument and beauty in quantities that would take a lifetime to fully use. Rome was waiting for him, and with it the courts, the crowds, and the first great test of everything he had so patiently and lovingly learned. That test, and the remarkable courage it would require of a young man not yet 30 years old, is the story we shall find ourselves drifting toward when next we rest together here, in the quiet hours, with the lamp burning soft and low. The Forum was still damp at that hour, the morning mist having only just begun to lift from the stones, curling away in slow, pale ribbons that dissolved somewhere above the rooftops of the basilicas and dissolved again into the whitening sky. The vendors had not yet arrived in full number, and the advocates and their clients were only beginning to gather in the colonnaded shade, speaking quietly to one another, in voices that the damp air seemed to muffle and soften, as though the city itself were not quite ready to be loud again. Into this world, still young and uncertain in the way that all genuinely gifted people are uncertain, not of their ability, but of the precise shape that ability ought to take, Marcus Tullius Cicero had come to make his name. He was in his mid-20s now, and the years of study had left him lean and keenly attentive, the sort of young man whose eyes move slightly faster than the conversation he is sitting inside. He had listened to the great advocates. He had watched how the best of them moved through a courtroom, how they shaped silence as deliberately as they shaped sentences, how they knew when to lower their voice to draw a crowd closer, and when to let a single word fall into the air and simply leave it there, unembellished. He had read everything, and heard everything, and written and rewritten, and practiced in the still lamplight of his study, until the phrases curved exactly as he wanted them to curve. And now the time for practice was, in the quiet and slightly terrifying way of all true beginnings, over. His earliest appearances before the courts of Rome were modest ones, careful ones, the kind of cases that allowed a young advocate to feel his footing without risking a fall that the whole city would remember. He handled matters of private law, civil disputes, the kind of tangled arrangements between citizens that required a steady mind and a clear argument more than they required brilliance, and he was good at it, already noticeably good, with a fluency in arrangement and a clarity of expression that made the judges lean in, just slightly, that made even the opposing advocates pay attention with the particular, reluctant attention of people who recognize something worth watching. But these were not yet the cases that would carry his name beyond the basilicas and the colonnades, not yet the kind of moment that a career is later understood to have pivoted upon. That moment came in the 79th or 80th year before the birth of Christ, it is said, when a man named Sextus Roscius of Ameria found himself in the most dangerous position that the Roman world could offer, accused of a crime he had not committed, by men with sufficient power and sufficient ruthlessness to make the accusation stick, regardless of its truth. The story as it has come down to us: Sextus Roscius the Elder, a wealthy landowner from the town of Ameria in Umbria, was murdered in Rome one night, killed in the street in the manner of those violent years when the city's darker corners were darker than usual. His death might have been mourned and settled quietly, a family's private grief, absorbed into the ordinary passage of time, but two of his relatives, men named Titus and Magnus, also bearing the name Roscius, had other intentions. They wanted the dead man's considerable estates, and they moved quickly, with the kind of speed that suggests the plan was not entirely improvised. They had the properties placed on the proscription lists, those terrible registers that the dictator Sulla had established, by which the property of enemies and undesirables could be legally seized and sold. And they arranged for a powerful freedman named Chrysogonus, a man close to Sulla's circle of influence, to purchase the estates at a fraction of their true worth. The arrangement suited everyone who was party to it. The problem was Sextus Roscius the Younger, the dead man's son, who was now not only grief-stricken but dispossessed, stripped of what should have been his inheritance, and when he protested, or when his protest simply became inconvenient, accused of having murdered his own father. It was a charge that required someone willing to defend it to stand inside a very uncomfortable proximity to power. Sulla was still the dominant force in Roman political life. Chrysogonus was connected, and connected men in that particular era had a way of making legal proceedings move in directions that suited their interests, rather than the evidence. The story goes that several of Rome's established advocates declined to take the case, not because they believed Roscius guilty, but because they understood the geometry of risk well enough to prefer a different morning's work, and so the case came to Cicero. We cannot know with perfect certainty what he felt in the days before the trial, but we can guess at something of it from the speech he later published, which has survived the long descent of centuries and still reads, even across the distance of 2,000 years, even in translation, even in the stripped and altered form that time always leaves on human documents, with a quality of controlled energy that suggests someone who had prepared not merely his argument, but his courage. He acknowledged openly in the speech itself that he was young, that others had declined, that there was a dimension to this case beyond its legal surface. He did not pretend the risk away. He named it and then he stepped past it, which is a different and more honest kind of bravery than simply pretending the risk does not exist. The oration that Cicero delivered in defense of Sextus Roscius was, by any account that reaches us, extraordinary. He laid out the evidence with a clarity that made the accusation seem not merely unfounded, but structurally absurd, tracing the sequence of events in a way that turned the accuser's own speed and eagerness against them, asking in effect why men so recently bereaved by a family murder would move so very efficiently to profit from the estate of the victim. He handled Chrysogonus with a particular kind of care, not attacking him directly in a way that would have invited immediate and dangerous retaliation, but constructing the argument in such a way that the audience understood perfectly well where the corruption lay, while Cicero retained the posture of a man merely following the evidence wherever reason led him. It was a kind of legal and rhetorical intelligence that is very difficult to teach. It can be shaped and refined by study, but at its core it requires a mind that understands how other minds receive information, how persuasion actually works in the space between a speaker and a crowd. Sextus Roscius was acquitted. The judges, facing a coherent argument and a courtroom that had been moved by the speech in the way that good speeches genuinely move people, not into excitement exactly, but into a kind of clarified attention, a sense of having understood something that had been murky, returned a verdict that freed the young man from Ameria and sent him back eventually towards some form of life. Whether he recovered the estates fully, the record does not say with certainty, but the verdict was his, and he walked free. And Cicero walked out of that basilica into the Roman afternoon, having become, in the course of a few hours of carefully arranged words, someone that the city would remember. The advocates noticed, the senators noticed, the kind of men who collected information about who was worth watching had his name now in the category of people who were absolutely worth watching. He was 26 or 27 years old, and he had stood in the most charged legal atmosphere his generation had yet produced, with the shadow of the dictator's power falling across the courtroom floor, and he had spoken as clearly and as precisely and as well as anyone in Rome could have spoken. He would leave Rome not long after this, traveling to Greece, and then to Rhodes to continue his studies, to rest his voice, which had been strained by his early exertions at the bar, it is said, and to deepen his understanding of the philosophical and rhetorical traditions that had been forming him since boyhood. It would be a few years before the city saw him again in full form, but it had seen enough now to know what kind of mind was moving through its colonnades. The mist that had softened the forum that morning had long since burned away by the time the verdict was given, and the stones of the basilica were warm underfoot, holding the collected heat of the day in the way that old stones do, slowly and without fanfare, as though warmth were a thing worth keeping as long as possible. In the years ahead, there would be more steps on the long road of Roman public life, more offices, more calculations, more mornings when the weight of ambition, and the weight of responsibility would feel like the same weight, pressing down from the same direction. But that road had now a beginning that was real, and his feet were on it, and the city stretched out around him in the late afternoon light, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply enormous and indifferent and full of possibility. The oil lamp on the writing table burns low and steady, its small flame holding still in the airless dark of a Roman evening, casting a warm circle of amber light across the wax tablets and curling scrolls that seem always, in Cicero's life, to surround him like faithful companions. And it is in that lamplight, that patient, unhurried glow, that we find him now, somewhere in the middle years of his ascent, pausing between one thing and the next, not yet arrived, but no longer merely beginning. There is a phrase the Romans used, a phrase that carried in its syllables the weight of generations and the quiet tyranny of expectation, the cursus honorum, which we might translate loosely and lovingly as the course of honors, or perhaps more truthfully, the ladder of honor, a prescribed sequence of public offices, each one a rung, each one requiring a man to wait his turn, to prove himself worthy in the eyes of his city, to climb not by leaping, but by placing one careful foot above the other, year after year, with the patience of someone who understands that Rome was not built in a single consulship, and that ambition, if it is to survive, must learn to wear the face of steadiness. Cicero understood this. He understood it in his bones, in the way a man who has grown up watching from outside the oldest rooms of power tends to understand the rules of those rooms with a sharpness that those born inside them never quite need to develop. He was not a man of ancient lineage. He was not the son of senators or the grandson of consuls. He was, as he himself would say more than once, with a mixture of pride and defensiveness, a new man, a novus homo, and new men in Rome had to earn what old families inherited, had to prove again and again, not only that they were capable, but that they were Roman enough, serious enough, steady enough to be trusted with the Republic's precious machinery. His first step on the ladder came in the year that historians place at around 75 years before the birth of Christ, when Cicero was elected quaestor, a word that sounds almost like a question, and in a way contains one, because the quaestorship was the office that asked of its holder, "Can you manage? Can you handle the practical, unglamorous, essential work of administration, of accounts and supplies, and the 10,000 ordinary transactions on which an empire's dignity depends?" The quaestors were the men who kept the ledgers, who oversaw the grain and the treasury, who made sure that the machinery of Roman governance had enough oil in it to keep turning without grinding to a halt. Cicero's quaestorship took him to western Sicily, to a region called Lilybaeum, on the island's far western tip, where the sea, on clear days, shone like hammered bronze in the afternoon sun, and the wind came in off the water, carrying the smell of salt and something older, something Mediterranean and ancient, and indifferent to Roman ambition. He served there with genuine diligence. The Sicilians, it is said, found him honest and fair and attentive in ways that not all Roman officials troubled themselves to be, and Cicero, for his part, seems to have found in Sicily something that surprised him, a kind of quiet satisfaction in doing the work well, in being trusted, in the humble pleasure of competence. He returned to Rome expecting, as a young man of his gifts might reasonably expect, that the city would have noticed his absence and be ready to welcome him back with at least a murmur of recognition. What he found instead was that Rome had barely registered he was gone. The city was vast and loud and perpetually absorbed in its own dramas, and one honest quaestor returning from a provincial posting was not the kind of event that caused people to set down their wine. He told this story on himself later, with what sounds like genuine rueful amusement, as though the experience had taught him something essential about the relationship between a man's sense of his own importance and the world's cheerful indifference to it. But he did not grow bitter. This is one of the things worth pausing over in the long corridor of Cicero's life, the way he absorbed setbacks and embarrassments, not by hardening into cynicism, but by sharpening his resolve, by returning always to the work itself, to the speeches, to the cases, to the slow accumulation of reputation that was the only currency a novus homo could reliably mint. He continued to appear in the courts. He continued to speak, and Rome, gradually, unmistakably, began to listen. The office of aedile came next in the sequence, and it was here that a Roman official was expected to demonstrate something rather different from the bookkeeping competence the quaestorship demanded. The aediles were responsible for the physical life of the city itself, for its temples and its streets, for the maintenance of public buildings, for the organization of games and festivals that the Roman people regarded not as luxuries, but as something closer to a civic right, a regular reassurance that the gods were appeased and the city was functioning as it should. It is worth imagining for a moment what this meant in practical terms. The noise of the city, the color of the festival days, the smell of roasting meat and incense, the sound of crowds gathering in the open spaces, all of it falling under the aedile's jurisdiction, all of it requiring a man who could manage not just numbers, but people, expectations, the volatile chemistry of public pleasure and public disappointment. Cicero moved through this office, as he moved through all the others, carefully, with his eye always on both the immediate task and the longer horizon, aware that every decision he made was being observed, catalogued, added to the account that Rome was quietly keeping on his behalf. He was not by temperament a man who loved administration for its own sake. What he loved was the word, the argument, the beautiful precision of a sentence that arrived at its destination having illuminated everything it passed through on the way. But he understood that the offices were not separable from the voice, that the authority which made people listen to him in the courts and the forums was the same authority that needed to be earned and re-earned in the grinding daily work of governance. The praetorship, when it came, brought him closer to the work he had always been most naturally suited for, because the praetors were, among other things, the senior legal officers of Rome. They presided over courts, they interpreted law, they stood at the intersection of justice and power in a way that suited Cicero's gifts as almost nothing else could. He served as praetor in the 66th year before the birth of Christ, elected first among the candidates, a distinction he noted with transparent satisfaction in his letters and speeches, because even a man as genuinely modest in some respects as Cicero was utterly incapable of false modesty when it came to electoral results. He had been chosen, and chosen first, and Rome had done him this honor, and he was not going to pretend the honor did not matter. It was during his praetorship that he spoke in favor of giving the great general Pompey the command against Mithridates in the east, a speech known as the Pro Lege Manilia, which stands as one of the earlier examples of Cicero's oratory surviving in full, its rhythms intact, its arguments still moving even across the enormous distance of 2,000 years. In it, you can hear the voice that was forming itself through all those years of study and practice and patient office holding, a voice that could turn a legal argument into something approaching music, that could make a proposition about military command feel like a meditation on the nature of Rome itself. Through all of it, through each rung of the long ladder, there ran alongside his ambition a thread of anxiety that he would not have been able to deny even if he had wanted to, an anxiety about acceptance, about whether Rome would truly welcome a man without the old bloodlines into its highest rooms, about whether all the eloquence and all the diligence would in the end be enough. He wrote about this anxiety in letters, returned to it in quiet moments, carried it with him the way a lamp carrier in a dark street carries the flame, carefully, always aware of how easily it could be extinguished. But the flame held, and now, as the lamplight steadies once more in the quiet of this telling, we find Cicero standing at the very edge of the highest rung, the consulship itself within reach, Rome watching, the lamp burning on into the night, warm and unwavering, waiting for whatever the morning will bring. Let that thought rest with you now, as the city settles and the lamp burns low, and let sleep come in its own time, unhurried as a Roman evening, sliding softly into night. Somewhere between the noise of the forum and the silence of sleep, there is a room. It is not a grand room, not a room that history tends to linger in, not the kind of room that appears in official records or is described in the speeches of senators. It is simply a study, lit by the warm and wavering glow of an oil lamp set upon a wooden table, its small flame bending gently whenever someone passes the doorway, casting long, soft shadows across the walls, across the scrolls resting in their cases, across the wax tablets and the stylus left mid-sentence, as though the man who was writing here only just stepped away and might return at any moment. This is the room where Cicero truly lived. Not in the rostra, not in the Senate chamber, not in the crowded basilicas where voices echoed and reputations rose and fell like tides. Here, in rooms like this one, in houses that smelled of cedar and lamp oil and the faint green drift of garden air, the private man existed, softer and more complicated than the public one, fuller of doubt and tenderness and longing than his speeches ever quite permitted him to show. We know this because he wrote letters, an extraordinary abundance of them, hundreds upon hundreds of letters that survived the centuries by some quiet miracle of preservation. Letters to his dear friend Atticus above all, letters that begin in political urgency and soften, almost without meaning to, into something far more intimate, into worry about money, into reports on what the garden looks like this season, into grief about a friendship that has cooled, or joy about a book that has just arrived from Alexandria, or the particular shade of light falling across the library at Tusculum on a late afternoon in autumn. No other figure from the ancient world left behind so vivid a record of simply being a person, and to read those letters late at night when the world is quiet is to feel the extraordinary nearness of a man who has been dead for more than 2,000 years. Let us settle, then, into that nearness. Let us rest here in the private world of Marcus Tullius Cicero. The villa at Tusculum was perhaps the place he loved most completely, a house set in the cool hills southeast of Rome, above the long summer heat of the city, surrounded by beech and oak, and the murmur of the kind of wind that seems to carry the whole weight of a civilization's countryside within it. He called it in his letters his Tusculanum, and he wrote about it with the undisguised affection of a man who knew that certain places restore something in us that crowds and obligations cannot help but slowly take away. The hills around Tusculum were old hills, inhabited long before Rome had grown into its astonishing self, and it is said that the air there was notably cooler and cleaner than in the valley below, so that scholars and wealthy Romans had for generations retreated there in the hottest months to think and breathe and remember who they were when no one was watching. Cicero had several properties over the course of his life, and the letters hint at the complicated mix of pride and anxiety with which he maintained them. There was his house on the Palatine Hill, in Rome itself, an elegant and prominent address that cost him what many considered a reckless sum, a house he acquired partly because the location announced to the world that he had arrived, that the son of the Arpinum countryside was now a man whose windows looked down upon the Forum. But the Tusculum villa was different. That one was not about arrival. That one was about becoming, or perhaps about returning to something quieter and more essential. He wrote there. He walked there in the long colonnaded garden, he describes with evident pleasure. He received friends there and talked long into the evenings about philosophy and rhetoric and the nature of the good life, the lamplight moving gently in the warm air of the terrace, the hills going dark around them as the stars came out one by one over the Latin countryside. It was at Tusculum, in particular, that his philosophical dialogues were composed, and it is telling that he chose this setting deliberately, setting several of those imagined conversations within its grounds. The place seeped into his thinking. It offered him what he so rarely had in Rome, which was time and quiet, and the sense that the world's immediate demands could be set briefly aside in favor of something more lasting. His marriage to Terentia lasted for many years, more than 30, though it would end in divorce, and history has sometimes been uncertain how to read the relationship between them. Terentia was by all accounts a woman of considerable force and independence, managing the family's affairs and finances with a competence that Cicero's letters acknowledge, sometimes warmly, sometimes with what reads like mild exasperation, and occasionally with what seems in the later letters like a sadness about the distance that had grown between them. She held property in her own name, managed their household affairs during his absences, and the story goes that she was not a woman who waited quietly for her husband's instructions, but rather one who acted, often decisively on her own judgment. Their early letters to one another, from periods when Cicero was away on official business or in the difficult years of his exile, carry a warmth that feels genuine, a tenderness that coexists with the practical anxieties of running a large Roman household. He worries about her health. He misses the children. He asks about the garden. He signs some of those early letters with expressions of affection that even 2,000 years of translation have not entirely drained of feeling. Later letters are cooler, briefer, more businesslike, and one senses without quite being told the particular sadness of a long marriage that has slowly grown formal between two people who once spoke differently to one another. Their son Marcus grew up in a household of extraordinary intellectual energy, and their daughter Tullia, whom Cicero called his Tulliola, his little Tullia, was the object of a love so transparent in the letters that it is almost uncomfortable to read, knowing what we know of what would eventually come, which we need not speak of tonight. For tonight we are resting in the quieter years, in the house on the hill, in the lamplight. Books were among the most vivid presences in Cicero's private life. He collected them with the devotion of a man who understood that a library is not merely a collection of objects, but a kind of extended self, a room in which all the best conversations you have ever had are preserved and waiting. His friend Atticus helped him acquire volumes from Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, and the letters are full of requests and thanks and the particular delight of a learned man finding a text he had long been searching for. He read widely in Greek philosophy, not as a dilettante but as someone genuinely wrestling with the questions those philosophers had raised, about how to live, about what constitutes goodness, about what we owe to one another and to the state, about how to bear grief, about how to face the end of things without flinching. These were not merely academic questions for him, they were practical ones, and they grew more practical as he aged. The letters to Atticus in particular feel like a man thinking out loud, using the act of writing to a trusted friend as a way of understanding what he himself believed, testing ideas in the intimacy of correspondence the way he might test arguments in a dialogue, and finding, sometimes, that the writing itself revealed something he had not known he thought until the stylus moved across the wax. And so here we rest, for a little while, in this private world. The lamp burns low on its table. Somewhere outside the villa, the night wind moves through the beech trees, a soft sound, persistent and unhurried. The same wind that moved through the hills above Arpinum when he was a boy, that moved through the streets of Rome on evenings when he walked home from the Forum, turning things over in his mind, that would move through all the places his life would take him. It is always there, that wind, carrying the smell of Italian earth and old stone, of lamp oil and the cool green breath of gardens, the steady quiet exhalation of a world that has been here long and will remain long after all our urgencies have stilled. In the chapter just ahead, that world will ask great things of him again. The consulship awaits, the highest office the Roman Republic could offer, and with it, the full weight of a civilization's hopes and fears. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight the lamp is burning, the letters are written, the garden is sleeping in the darkness below the terrace, and there is nothing that needs doing yet. Rest now. Let the wind carry you a little further in. There is a particular quality to early morning air in Rome, a coolness that arrives before the light does, settling into the stones of the streets, rising off the Tiber in slow white ribbons, wrapping itself around the columns of temples that stand half visible in the gray before dawn. On the first day of January, in the 63rd year before the birth of Christ, that air carried something else with it, something harder to name than cold or damp, something closer to the hell breath of a city that knows, even in its sleep, that the world is about to arrange itself differently. Along the Sapor Via, the oil lamps had been burning since well before midnight, in the houses of those who had business with the new day. And in one house in particular, a house on the Palatine Hill, not the grandest house on that famous slope, but a serious and well-appointed one, full of scrolls and correspondence, and the particular organized hush of a man who thinks for a living. Marcus Tullius Cicero was already awake, already dressed, already holding in his hands a day that he had been working toward for the whole of his 43 years on earth. He was consul. The word, even when he turned it quietly in his mind, must have seemed almost too large to fit inside an ordinary morning. Consul of Rome, not merely a senator, not merely an advocate of brilliant reputation, not merely a name that people recognized in the forums and the law courts and the better dinner parties, but consul, one of two men elected each year to stand at the very top of the Republic's long ladder of honor, to hold the fasces, to chair the Senate, to give their names to the year itself. Later generations would speak of the 63rd year before the birth of Christ simply as the year of Cicero and Antonius, as Romans always named their years by the consuls who had governed them, and so Cicero's name was written, quite literally, into the calendar of history before a single day of his consulship had properly begun. What makes his election remarkable and what Cicero himself never quite stopped remarking upon was that he had arrived at this summit without the thing that most Roman consuls carried as their most reliable passport, ancient blood. He was, as he wore with complicated pride, a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family ever to hold the consulship, the first to climb this particular height without ancestors already waiting at the top to receive him. The great senatorial families, the Metelli, the Sulahe, the descendants of names carved into the oldest monuments, had been watching this clever man from Arpinum for years with a mixture of admiration and unease, the way one might watch a very gifted musician who has learned entirely by ear rather than by instruction. He was undeniably good. It was simply that he had not come from anywhere they recognized. And yet, in the elections of 64, the summer elections that determined who would govern the following year, the Roman people had chosen him. They had chosen him, it is said, with an enthusiasm unusual even for a popular candidate, and they had chosen him first among the two consuls, which carried its own quiet distinction. The centuries voted him through, one after another, before the balloting was even finished. His colleague in the consulship was Gaius Antonius Hybrida, a man of good family and middling gifts, the kind of capable, unremarkable senator around whom history tends to arrange itself without quite touching. Cicero had managed the delicate business of their partnership with the careful tact of a man who understood that the consulship was his great opportunity and could not afford the friction of a difficult colleague. He had, the story goes, arranged to exchange provinces with Antonius in advance, giving his colleague the more lucrative governorship of Macedonia, which would come after their year in office, in exchange for Antonius's reliable quietness during the consulship itself. It was a practical arrangement, not the most glorious of bargains, but Cicero was always a man who understood that politics required the occasional clean transaction beneath its more elevated rhetoric. The consulship demanded an enormous range of things from a man, and what is so striking when you read Cicero's own accounts of this year, in his letters and in the speeches he composed during it, is how genuinely he felt the weight of each of those demands. He presided over the Senate, and the Senate in this period was a body of several hundred men, each one carrying his own interests, his own debts, his own loyalties, his own carefully managed relationships with the powerful figures who were beginning to move beneath the surface of Roman political life like slow currents under still water. To chair that body was to manage a conversation that was never entirely honest, in a room where every silence meant something, and every word chosen for its public effect had another meaning arranged behind it for those who knew how to read the arrangement. He heard cases, he dealt with embassies from the provinces and from foreign cities who had business with Rome, receiving their representatives with the formal courtesy that Roman tradition required, and sorting through their requests with the administrative thoroughness that the job demanded. He supervised the functioning of the city itself, the markets, the temples, the endless grinding business of supply and distribution and infrastructure that kept a population of perhaps 500,000 people fed and housed, and if not quite happy, at least not openly ungovernable. He gave speeches, naturally. This was the element of the consulship that came most naturally to him, the place where the trained voice and the rhetorical intelligence found their fullest expression, and the speeches he delivered in his consular year are among the most carefully crafted of his career, each one shaped with the awareness that he was speaking not only to the people or the Senate in front of him, but to some wider audience, some imagined future readership, that he seemed always to sense watching from just beyond the edge of the present moment. There was legislation to consider, too. Cicero navigated a land reform bill proposed by a tribune named Rullus, a proposal that would have redistributed public land and created a commission of 10 men with substantial powers over Roman territory, with a combination of genuine republican principle and strategic caution, and he opposed it in speeches to both the Senate and the popular assemblies, and the bill was withdrawn. Whether his opposition was purely principled, or partly a matter of protecting certain interests and relationships that he had carefully cultivated over the years, is one of those questions that the ancient sources leave gently open, as they tend to do with questions about men whose motives were almost always more than one thing at once. Through all of this, the ceremonies, the Senate sessions, the legal hearings, the speeches, the administrative details, the careful management of allies, and the equally careful management of enemies, Cicero carried what he always carried, an awareness of his own improbability. He had not been supposed to be here. The system that Rome called the cursus honorum The ladder of honor he had climbed step by careful step was designed in practice, if not in law, for men whose families had already climbed it before them. And yet, here he was, on the Palatine Hill, in the consul's house, wearing the toga with its broad purple stripe, hearing himself addressed by the titles that belonged to the highest office in the Republic. He wrote about it to his friends. He could not quite help writing about it. The pride was genuine, and the wonder was genuine, and even the anxiety was genuine. The sense that something this elevated, this improbable, this carefully constructed, might at any moment prove fragile in ways he had not yet discovered. The lamps in Rome burned late that winter, as they always did when the great business of the city required men to work past the short daylight hours, and Cicero worked by their light as he had always worked, bending over his correspondence, turning over his speeches, listening to the reports of his staff, holding in careful balance the 1,000 threads that the consulship required him to hold at once. The smoke from the oil lamps drifted up through the rooms of his Palatine house and out into the cool Roman air, joining the smoke from 1,000 other lamps across the city, all of them burning against the dark, all of them holding their small circles of warmth and visibility in a world that winter made very large and very shadowed. He did not know, in these first weeks of his consular year, what the year would ask of him. He did not know that before the winter was finished, Rome would present him with a test that no amount of preparation had quite prepared him for, a crisis that would require him to act, not merely as an administrator or an orator, but as something closer to a guardian of the Republic itself. He could not see it yet. It was still gathering in the shadows, still taking shape in the back rooms and the private conversations of men whose ambitions were darker than his own. For now there was only the January morning and the cool lamplight, and the city breathing quietly below the Palatine, and Marcus Tullius Cicero, consul of Rome, sitting with his papers in the early dark, doing what he had always done best. There is a particular quality to autumn nights in Rome, a cooling of the air that comes not all at once but slowly, the way a fire settles into its own embers, the warmth retreating by degrees until the stone of the old buildings holds a chill that the sun will take half the morning to undo. It was in just such a season, in the months that followed Cicero's election to the consulship, that the city began to feel something it could not quite name, a restlessness beneath the ordinary noise of the forum, a tension like the skin of a drum pulled too tight, something trembling at a frequency too low to hear, but not too low to feel. The man at the center of that trembling was Lucius Sergius Catiline, as history has come to call him, a Roman aristocrat of ancient lineage and exhausted fortune, a man whose face, it is said, carried a kind of rough beauty that could still a room, and whose ambitions had long outgrown whatever means remained to satisfy them. He had sought the consulship himself more than once, and had been turned away more than once, and something in those refusals had curdled in him, had become not merely disappointment, but a slow, hot grievance against the Republic itself, against the whole arrangement of things that kept rewarding men like Cicero, while leaving men like Catiline to watch from the edges of the great feast they felt they deserved. Cicero had been watching him. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened in those autumn months of the 63rd year before the birth of Christ, that Cicero had been watching and listening and gathering for a long time before he spoke. He had informants, people whose names history has largely been content to forget, men and women who moved through the lower rooms of Roman social life and carried back to the consul's house on the Palatine the fragments of conversation that, laid end to end, began to form a picture. And the picture, as it came together, was a dark one. There was talk of fires. There was talk of debts that could only be settled by turning the existing order entirely upside down. There was talk of men gathering outside Rome, in Etruria, where a soldier named Gaius Manlius was said to be assembling an army of the desperate and the dispossessed. Catiline moved through the city with a strange combination of openness and secrecy, as they daring someone to say aloud what everyone was beginning to whisper. He dined with senators, he smiled in the forum, he was, by all visible measures, simply a disappointed candidate continuing to participate in public life. And yet the meetings in certain houses went on past the hour when honest men slept. And yet the names of the men who attended those meetings when Cicero's informants brought them to him, were names that suggested something far beyond ordinary political scheming. There was a night in late October when Cicero learned that a meeting had taken place in the house of a man named Marcus Porcius Laeca, a meeting at which specific plans had apparently been laid, plans not merely for the overthrow of the Republic in some abstract sense, but plans with dates and targets and the particular kind of operational detail that separates ambition from conspiracy. It is said that at this meeting, 2 men had volunteered to call upon the consul the following morning, as though paying a social visit, and to kill him in his home. Cicero was warned. He strengthened the guard at his door. They were turned away. And then, on the 7th day of November, Cicero summoned the Senate to the Temple of Jupiter Stator, an old sanctuary at the foot of the Palatine, solid and grave in the early morning light. And Catiline, in what must count as one of the more remarkable acts of bravado in Roman history, came. He sat among the senators, and the senators around him quietly shifted, moving away, leaving him a small island of empty space in the assembled body of the Republic. And into that charged silence, Cicero began to speak. What he said has been preserved more or less in the form he later gave it for reading. And even at this great distance, even translated and carried across more than 2,000 years, something of its force remains. He did not accuse Catiline of things he could not prove. He laid out with the quiet, inexorable precision of a man who has spent months assembling a mosaic from individual tiles, exactly what he knew, exactly what had been planned, exactly how much the consul of Rome already understood about the shape of the conspiracy. He spoke not in rage, but in a kind of terrible composure, and that composure, the story goes, was more frightening than any shouting could have been. Catiline left Rome the following day. He went to join Manlius and the army gathering in Etruria, which meant that whatever pretense of civic participation had remained was now finished. His departure was itself a confession, at least in the eyes of those who had been watching. In Rome, the Senate declared him and Manlius public enemies, and the men he had left behind in the city, a network of co-conspirators who had been tasked with managing the Roman end of the operation, the fires, the disruptions, the violence meant to accompany the army's march. Those men now had to operate without their principal, watched by a consul who knew more about their plans than they knew he knew. It was through a delegation from a Gallic tribe called the Allobroges, who had come to Rome on a separate matter entirely and had been approached by the conspirators in the hope that they might provide cavalry, that Cicero obtained what he had not yet quite had: the written evidence, the letters, the physical proof that could be presented to the Senate and the Roman people, not as inference or intelligence, but as incontrovertible fact. The Allobroges, calculating their own interests with a shrewdness the conspirators had badly underestimated, brought those letters to Cicero. On the 3rd day of December, the ringleaders were arrested. The letters were produced. The Senate met, and the reading of what those letters contained left very little ambiguity. What followed was the hardest decision of Cicero's consulship, and perhaps of his life. The question before the Senate was what to do with the men in custody, men who were Roman citizens, who had not yet been tried, who stood accused of crimes serious enough that the usual protections of Roman law seemed to some senators entirely insufficient to the moment. Execution without trial was not, in any ordinary reading of Roman law, permitted, and yet the argument on the other side, that these men left alive would either be rescued by their allies or would find some other means of continuing their work, was not an argument that could simply be dismissed. The debate in the Senate was long and serious and genuinely uncertain in its outcome for a time. Julius Caesar, still a relatively young politician at this point, spoke against execution, proposing instead perpetual imprisonment in various Italian towns. Cato the Younger spoke in favor of death. And Cicero, who presided, who listened to both arguments with the attentiveness that was his great professional gift, ultimately came down on the side of execution. The men were taken to the Tullianum, the old prison near the Forum, and there on the 5th day of December in the 63rd year before the birth of Christ, they were put to death. When Cicero emerged from the prison and announced to the crowd waiting outside with that single word, vixerunt, they have lived, a Roman way of saying they are dead, the crowd, it is said, acclaimed him with extraordinary warmth. He walked home through the torchlit streets to cheering. Catulus, one of the most senior men in Rome, called him the father of his fatherland. It was the highest point of his public life, the moment at which every year of study and practice and patient climbing had arrived at something that felt, in the cooling air of that November night, like vindication complete. And yet even in the warmth of those torches, even in the sound of that acclaim rising and then settling back into the ordinary noises of the Roman dark, Cicero understood, because he was Cicero, because his mind could not rest from understanding things, that he had also crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had executed Roman citizens without trial. There were men in Rome who would remember that. There were men who would in time find a way to use it. But all of that lay ahead, and for this night the city breathed more easily, the danger dispersed for now like smoke thinning in still air. The Republic had held. Cicero had held it. In his study later, a lamp would have burned low in its dish of oil, the small flame steady in the quiet room, throwing warm light across the shelves of scrolls and the wax tablets covered in draft and counterdraft, all the working materials of a mind that had spent itself completely in the service of words, and had this once found that words were enough. In the chapter still to come, we will rest among those words themselves, slipping into the world of Roman oratory and the art that Cicero spent a lifetime making. For now, let the lamp burn low, and let the story hold you gently into sleep. The lamps are already burning in the city when the orator sits down to think. It is late evening in Rome, and the streets below are quieting in their gradual, unhurried way. The vendors folding their cloths, the children being called indoors, the last of the water sellers making their slow way back toward the Tiber with empty amphorae balanced on their shoulders. From a window in one of the houses on the Palatine Hill, a small flame is visible to anyone who might look up. A single oil lamp set close to a writing table, its light steady and warm, casting a pool of amber across wax tablets and rolled papyrus and the careful, thinking hands of a man who believes, with every thread of his being, that the right words, arranged in precisely the right order, can change the world. This is the world we rest inside tonight. Not the courtroom yet, not the thundering rostra, not the packed and sweating forum with its thousands of upturned faces, but the quiet place before all of that. The room where the speech is born, the silence from which the voice will eventually rise. It is worth dwelling here for a long while, because it is easy to hear the word oratory and imagine only the performance, the outstretched arm, the ringing period, the crowd's collective breath held and then released. But what Cicero understood, and what the greatest practitioners of his art understood, was that the rostra was only the final destination of a much longer journey, one that began in exactly this kind of stillness, in lamplight, in the patient searching of a mind for the precise phrase that would make a listener feel something true. The Romans had a word for the whole architecture of this art. They called it rhetoric, borrowed from the Greeks who had given so much to Rome's intellectual life, and they understood it not as a trick or a decoration, but as a genuine discipline, as serious and as demanding in its way as architecture or medicine or law. To speak well in the world Cicero inhabited was not simply to open one's mouth with confidence. It was to have studied the structure of argument, to have absorbed the principles of invention and arrangement and style, to have practiced delivery until it felt natural, to have committed vast stores of knowledge to memory so that any subject at any moment might be addressed with something approaching wisdom. It was a lifelong occupation, and for Cicero, it was also a lifelong love. Walk with him now, if you will, through the Forum Romanum in the early morning hours, before the day grows loud. The paving stones are still cool beneath the sandal. The temples at the far end, Saturn's columns, the curved porch of Vesta, catch the first pale light and hold it for a moment, golden and uncertain, before it spills down across the open space where in a few hours the business of Rome will roar back into life. The rostra stands at the northwest end of the Forum, a long raised platform faced in the bronze prows of captured ships, a reminder that speech and power and military victory were, in Rome, never very far apart. It is from here, or from platforms very like it, that the great voices of the late Republic carried their words out over crowds of Roman citizens gathered below. Try to imagine what it was like to stand among those crowds. The smell alone would have been extraordinary. Bodies pressed together, garlic and wine and wood smoke, the faint sweetness of garlands draped on nearby shrines, and underneath all of it the ever-present scent of the Tiber, that ancient river moving slow and brown through the city's heart, carrying everything with it. The sound of Rome before a great speech was not silence, but a kind of layered murmur, thousands of private conversations slowly subsiding as the orator appeared, as his figure became visible above the crowd, as his voice, that carefully trained, carefully modulated instrument, reached out toward the far edges of the gathered assembly. For those who heard Cicero speak, the experience is described in terms that suggest something close to enchantment. Ancient writers speak of the way his voice could shift, from the quiet, intimate register of a man confiding a painful truth, to the full soaring power of a man denouncing injustice before the gods themselves. And all of it managed with a control so complete that it seemed entirely natural, entirely unforced. It is said that he could make a courtroom weep, and then within the same speech, make them smile with a wry and perfectly timed observation that broke the tension like a hand opening. The wit was always present, never cruel, never merely decorative. It was structural. It was part of the argument. He wrote about all of this himself, at length and with unmistakable delight. In his work on the ideal orator, composed during one of the quieter stretches of his life, he described conversations among great men of an earlier generation, sitting in a garden at Tusculum. And it is worth pausing on that detail, the garden at Tusculum, because it tells us something about how the Romans thought about learning. The best thinking, in Cicero's understanding, happened not in lecture halls, but in the unhurried atmosphere of good company, in the shade of a tree in the late afternoon, with the sound of water somewhere nearby. Philosophy and rhetoric, and the whole enormous project of understanding how to live well, these were things you talked through with friends across many years, in places where time moved gently. And then you took those conversations home and worked them into something that would last. Back in the lamplight now, back in the late-night room with the writing tools and the small, steady flame. The preparation of a speech for the Roman Forum was an act of both inspiration and extraordinary craft. Cicero would begin with the essential question of invention. What are the arguments? What does the law say? What does precedent say? What does common human feeling say? He would think through the arrangement with the care of an architect laying out a building's proportions, ensuring that each section served the next, that the opening created the right atmosphere of trust and attention, that the narrative section made the facts vivid and clear, that the arguments built steadily toward their conclusion, and that the closing peroration, the great emotional summation, arrived with the inevitability of a wave that has been gathering force across a long stretch of open water. Style was the next consideration, and here the lamp might burn very late indeed, because Cicero believed with passionate conviction that how you said a thing was inseparable from what you were saying. A poorly chosen word, a sentence that stumbled in its rhythm, a metaphor that called the wrong thing to mind, any of these could undermine an argument that was logically perfect. He listened to his own sentences as a musician listens to a phrase, testing the rise and fall of syllables, the placement of stress, the length of clauses, the way a period should close with a sound that felt like the drawing of a satisfying breath. Latin in his hands was not simply a means of communication. It was an instrument, and he played it with the attentiveness of someone who understood how rarely such instruments come along. Memory and delivery were the final arts, and here again the Romans had developed methods of extraordinary sophistication. The technique of the memory palace, the practice of placing the parts of a speech inside an imagined building and then walking through its rooms during delivery, was already old in Cicero's day, inherited from Greek teachers who had passed it down through generations of students. And delivery itself encompassed everything from the angle of the body to the gesture of a single hand, each movement codified and practiced until it belonged not to the rules but to the speaker himself, until it had become, in the deepest sense, natural. What Cicero left behind in his writings on all of this is not simply instruction but testimony. The testimony of a man who found in the cultivation of speech one of the genuinely beautiful activities available to a human life. He believed that the good orator and the good man were at their core the same person. That to speak well about justice, you had to understand justice, had to care about it, had to be willing to stand in a public place and defend it even when that was uncomfortable. The word was not separate from the life. The lamp burning in the study was connected, by a long chain of discipline and love, to the voice ringing out over the forum. The forum is quiet now. The lamplight holds. The Tiber moves somewhere in the darkness beyond the city's edge, slow and constant, the way water always moves when it has a long way yet to go. Let that sound carry you toward sleep tonight, and know that tomorrow we will follow Cicero into a harder place, into the years when all of this was taken from him, when the city he had spent his life loving turned its face away, and the long road of exile began. The road south from Rome grows quieter the further you walk from the city's heart, and on a morning in the late winter of the 58th year before the birth of Christ, a man walked that road not in triumph, but in something closer to dissolution. His sandals raising small clouds of pale dust, his shoulders carrying a weight that no toga, however fine, could conceal. The olive groves on either side were just beginning to show the faintest silver green of new growth, and the light fell through the branches in long, diffuse columns, the way light falls through the high windows of a room that has recently been abandoned. Cicero was leaving Rome. He had not been driven out by soldiers, not yet, not in any formal sense, and this perhaps made it harder to bear, for there was no clean moment of force against which a man might harden himself. There was only the slow, suffocating accumulation of pressure, the knowledge that a law had been engineered with his name written into it, a law proposed by the tribune Publius Clodius Pulcher, who had waited for his moment with the patience of someone who has learned to love waiting. The law, as these things tend to do, dressed itself in the language of principle, that any man who had put Roman citizens to death without trial should be denied fire and water, the ancient elemental symbols of welcome in life, within a certain distance of the city. It named no one. It needed to name no one. Everyone in Rome understood whose shadow it cast. The executions of the Catilinarian conspirators, carried out on Cicero's order a full 5 years before, had been the great proud act of his consulship, and now they became the instrument of his undoing. He had spent those 5 years in the knowledge that the question of their legality had never been fully settled, that the men he had ordered strangled in the Tullianum prison had been Roman citizens, and that Roman citizens by ancient right could not be executed without the judgment of the people. He had believed, and still believed, that the emergency had warranted it, that the Republic had been burning, and he had put out the fire in the only way available to him. But belief, as any honest mind eventually discovers, is not the same as immunity. And so he walked. He walked because to stay was to face the full formal weight of that law, and because his allies, the men he had imagined might stand beside him, had, one by one, found reasons to stand slightly to one side instead. It is said that he went in mourning dress, his hair uncut and his face unshaved, in the manner of a man in grief, and that people came out along the road to press his hands and weep, and that this tenderness, which in other circumstances might have warmed him, only deepened his desolation, because the hands that reached for his were the hands of ordinary people, and not the hands of senators or generals who might have changed the outcome. Even Julius Caesar, even Pompey the Great, men who understood what Cicero had done and why, had chosen in the end not to make his cause their own. They had their own calculations, their own arrangements, and Cicero was not central to any of them. He moved south toward the sea, and then further east still, crossing into Macedonia and making his way eventually to Thessalonica, which sits in a wide bay in the north of Greece, where the light on the water has a particular quality in the early mornings, silver gray and uncommonly still, as though the sea itself were resting. He would have seen that light, if he could see anything through what his letters describe as a fog of grief so total that it altered his experience of every waking hour. The letters from this period are among the most painful documents he ever wrote, and Cicero, who wrote so much, wrote with an honesty about his own suffering that Romans of his generation did not always permit themselves. He wrote to his dear friend Atticus in terms that make a careful reader pause, letters full of self-recrimination and confusion, letters in which he moves without warning, from rational analysis of his situation to passages of raw, almost formless grief. He blamed himself for not having fought harder, for having left Rome before the law was formally passed, for having trusted men who proved to be made of something softer than he had imagined. He asked again and again whether he had made the right choice, and the asking itself tells us something, that he was not sure, that in the long empty hours in Thessalonica, with the sea making its patient sounds outside his window, he turned the question over and found it rough on every side. What a man cannot do in exile, perhaps, is settle. The word itself, exile, carries within it the sense of removal from the natural place, and Cicero was a man whose nature was entirely woven into the rhythms of Roman life, the courts, the forums, the Senate house, the morning salutations of clients arriving at his door. Without those rhythms, he could not quite find the edges of himself. He moved from Thessalonica to Dyrrhachium on the Adriatic coast, perhaps because being closer to Italy felt like a form of proximity to what he had lost, or perhaps simply because a grieving man moves and stillness becomes unbearable. The sea was different there, choppier, more insistent, the color of hammered bronze in the afternoons, and it is said he spent long hours watching it, which is what people do when thought has exhausted itself and only looking remains. His family were in Rome, which meant that his anxiety about them wove itself through everything else like a secondary thread in a dark cloth. Terentia, his wife, was managing the household with the competence she had always possessed, and that Cicero in his letters sometimes acknowledged with a gratitude edged in guilt. His daughter Tullia, his beloved Tullia, was navigating her own life in a city that had effectively declared her father a disgraced man. His son Marcus, still a child, was growing in a house that bore his father's absence the way a garden bears a drought, continuing but diminished. The letters between Rome and wherever Cicero happened to be are full of practical concerns about money, about property that enemies were already moving to seize, about the political weather in Rome and whether it was shifting. Terentia wrote to him, and Tullia wrote to him, and reading between the careful lines of what survives, one senses women trying to sustain a man who was in some essential way coming apart. And yet, the exile lasted, in the end, not years plural, but something closer to 18 months. And the story of its ending is not, finally, a story of defeat, but of the slow turning of a tide. Rome without Cicero was still a city in which Cicero's allies worked quietly and persistently to reverse what Clodius had done. Pompey, whose position made him useful in ways that conscience alone does not always explain, eventually moved in Cicero's favor. New tribunes took office who were sympathetic. A vote was taken, and it was not close. It is said the assembly voted for his recall by numbers that left little ambiguity about where the Roman people, whatever the Roman great men had chosen, felt their loyalties lay. The journey back was itself a kind of procession, unhurried and full of the peculiar emotion of a man returning to something he had feared he might never see again. He came up through southern Italy, and the towns along the way greeted him. And in the late summer light of those Italian afternoons, with the fields golden and the air carrying the dry, warm scent of harvested grain, something in him that had been contracted for 18 months began, slowly, to release. He arrived at Brundisium first, that busy port on the heel of Italy, where the sea narrows toward the east, and it is said that when he set foot on Italian soil again and felt the particular quality of that dust under his feet, pale, familiar, Roman dust, he wept. He would enter Rome itself on the 4th day of September, in the 57th year before the birth of Christ, and the reception the city gave him was, by every account that survives, extraordinary. Crowds on the rooftops, crowds in the streets, the kind of welcome that a city offers when it has decided to say, without qualification, that it is glad you are back. But that is a story for another quiet moment, when you have rested a little and are ready to follow him through the gates and back into the complicated, shimmering life of a man who never stopped finding Rome both his greatest love and his most exacting companion. For now, let the sound of the sea at Dyrrhachium settle around you, that patient bronze-colored water, moving against the stones, indifferent to exile and return alike, washing the shore in the same slow rhythm it has always kept. The road back to Rome was paved with something softer than triumph, though triumph was what the crowds offered him. It is said that when Cicero finally received word of his recall from exile, that long-awaited, almost disbelieved permission to return, he did not leap at once into motion, but stood for a long moment in the quiet of wherever he happened to be, feeling the news settle into him the way rain settles into dry ground, slowly, unevenly, finding the cracks first. He had been gone for more than a year of wandering through Thessalonica and Dyrrachium and the dusty corridors of Greek cities that were beautiful, but were not Rome. And in that time something in him had shifted, like furniture moved in a room you know by heart, so that even in the dark you reach for what is no longer there. He had written letters of such raw sorrow during those months that even across 2,000 years they retain their sting, their embarrassing, tender, nakedly human pain. And now the pain was meant to be over. Now he was going home. He crossed back into Italy in the late summer of the year that followed his banishment, and the welcome he received was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The story goes that crowds gathered along the roads as word spread of his coming, people who had perhaps heard one of his speeches, or benefited in some small way from his consulship, or simply felt that Rome without Cicero was a Rome that had done something it ought not to have done, and wished to correct the feeling by standing at the roadside in the dusty afternoon and raising their voices as he passed. In the Forum there was a kind of organized rejoicing, the Senate voting formally and with apparent enthusiasm for his restoration, the streets filling with the sound of celebration that in the warm Roman evening would have carried far up the hills and into the alleys where lamp oil was already beginning to burn against the encroaching dark. He gave a speech of thanks, and then another after that, to the Senate, to the people, to the gods, because this was what you did, and because for Cicero, speaking was the closest thing to breathing that he knew. But underneath all of this, underneath the crowds and the speeches and the formal restoration of his dignity and property, something had changed, and Cicero felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before you can name it, a certain quality of light, a particular stillness in the air. The Rome he returned to was not the Rome he had left, or rather, it was exactly the same Rome, and that was precisely the problem. The same forces that had undone him were still at work. Clodius Pulcher still moved through the city, with his networks of organized violence, his hired men, his talent for making the popular will into a weapon, and looming over everything, like mountains looming over a valley that has grown accustomed to forgetting they are there, were the three great men who now effectively governed the Roman world between them, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, bound together in that uneasy, unofficial arrangement that later ages would come to call the First Triumvirate, though in Cicero's day it wore no name, only the heavy, shapeless weight of its own power. Cicero had always been a man of the Senate, of the Republic, of the institutions and traditions that gave Roman public life its shape and its meaning. He believed in these things not naively, but deeply, the way a person believes in the ground beneath their feet, not thinking about it constantly, but trusting it utterly, and feeling the vertigo sharply when it shifts. And what he found on his return was that the ground had shifted. The triumvirate did not dissolve the Republic. They were far too careful, too Roman themselves for anything so blunt. They simply made it increasingly difficult to act as though the Republic were the only thing that mattered, as though the Senate's vote were the final word, as though a man of conscience could speak plainly without first calculating whose shadow he might be speaking from beneath. There were moments in these years when Cicero attempted to work within the new arrangement, to find some accommodation with its powers. He spoke in support of measures he privately found distasteful, and this cost him something. You can hear it if you listen carefully, in the slight change of register in his letters from this period, a flatness here, a forced brightness there. The literary equivalent of a man who smiles when he does not quite feel like smiling. He wrote to his great friend Atticus with a candor he rarely allowed himself in public, telling him of his unhappiness, his sense of constriction, his longing for something he struggled to name but which was, at its heart, simply the freedom to say what he thought and have it matter. The letters of these years are remarkable documents full of the texture of a restless, gifted mind, chafing against circumstances it cannot quite accept and cannot quite resist. And so gradually, with a kind of grace that is perhaps only visible in retrospect, Cicero began to turn inward. or not inward exactly. He was never truly a man of the interior, never a hermit or a mystic, but rather backward and upward toward the great questions that Greek philosophy had spent centuries articulating, and that he had first encountered as a young student, sitting at the feet of masters in Rhodes and Athens, feeling the warm Aegean wind against his face, and understanding for the first time that thought itself could be a kind of architecture, a way of building something that would stand. He began to write with a seriousness and a scope that his earlier career had not quite allowed, the busy years of courts and campaigns and consulships having left little room for the slow, patient work of composition at its deepest level. His beloved villa at Tusculum, set in the hills southeast of Rome, where the air was cooler and the cypress trees stood dark against the evening sky, became something like a refuge and a workshop in one. He had rebuilt it after Clodius's men had done their damage to his properties, and to restore a place you love is to know it differently afterwards, more consciously, more gratefully, with a sharper awareness of what it feels like to be there, the particular quality of morning light through a certain window, the sound of the garden and wind. Here he read and dictated and walked the pathways he had planted with his own aesthetic preferences in mind, and thought about the nature of the ideal state, about the foundations of law, about what it meant to live a good life in a world that was not always arranged to make goodness easy. The works that began to emerge from these restless, complicated years were not the product of a man who had given up on the world, but of one who was trying to understand it more deeply than politics alone would ever allow. He was thinking about Plato, about Aristotle, about the long tradition of Greek thought that Rome had absorbed, and that he believed Rome needed to hear again in Latin, in his own voice, made accessible and alive for a Roman readership that might not have the Greek, but that deserved, he felt, the ideas. There is something quietly heroic about this project, about the decision to make beauty and philosophy into a kind of public gift, to say, here, take this has mattered to me, perhaps it will matter to you, perhaps in this lies something that outlasts the noise of whatever particular crisis we are presently inhabiting. The restless years, then, were not lost years. They were years of a different kind of making, years in which the lamp burned later in the study, and the scroll accumulated its careful sentences with a patience that public life had never quite required. Rome moved around him, loud and complicated and never quite at peace with itself, and Cicero moved within it, doing what he had always done but with a new and deepening gravity, as though the suffering of exile had burned away some final layer of performance and left something truer underneath. And in his letters, always the letters, to Atticus, to his brother Quintus, to the long constellation of friends and acquaintances and distant correspondents, who together formed the soft human web of his inner life, the lamp of his thought kept burning, steadily, personally, warmly, finding its way into rooms he would never see, carried by messengers across a world that was slowly, and without quite announcing itself, beginning to change in ways that would ask more of him than he yet knew. For now, though, he was home. The villa was rebuilt. The books were open, and the night was quiet enough, at least for a while, to work. There are mornings in the Italian winter when the light arrives slowly, almost reluctantly, as though it too is grieving something, pale and thin across the bare olive groves, lying flat against the cold stone of the villas and the garden walls, offering warmth enough to see by, but not enough to feel. It was in weather something like this, in the early weeks of the 45th year before the birth of Christ, that a letter came to Cicero. Or perhaps it was a messenger who came in person, breathless and solemn at the threshold. The ancient sources are not entirely clear on the precise moment, and what was carried to him in words or in the look upon a face was the news that his daughter Tullia was gone. She had died at Tusculum, it is believed, in the weeks following the birth of a child who did not long survive her. She was somewhere in her early 30s, young, by any reckoning, by any century's reckoning. And Cicero, who had loved her with a constancy that outlasted 2 marriages, a political exile, and all the turbulence of a life lived at the center of the most complicated city in the world, was left undone by it in a way that nothing else had ever quite managed. He had always written about her with a particular warmth. In his letters, she appears again and again, his Tulliola, his little Tullia, even when she was grown, and there is in those references a tenderness that he permitted himself very rarely in correspondence about anything else. The political world required a kind of careful performance at all times, a calibrated voice, a measured tone, but when he wrote of her, something loosened in him. She had accompanied him to the harbor when he returned from exile. She had written to him in the dark years. She had, by all accounts, possessed both intelligence and good spirit, and whatever else may have been uncertain or painful in Cicero's private life, and there was a great deal that was uncertain and painful, she had been simply a constant. And now the lamp that had been her presence in his life was put out, and the room it had lit for 30 years was very dark indeed. He withdrew to a small island property he owned near Astura, on the coast south of Rome, a quiet place, surrounded by water, close to the sound of the sea, and there he did what grief required of him, which was to be alone with it and not pretend otherwise. His friends wrote to him. The letters that survive from this period are remarkable documents, both for what his correspondents said and for what they confessed they could not say. Sulpicius Rufus, a distinguished jurist and an old friend, wrote him a letter of consolation that has been preserved across the centuries, and in it he attempted, gently and with great care, to offer the perspective that suffering is woven into the nature of all things, that what has perished is one loss among many, that even Rome itself, the monuments, the marble, the empire, will not last forever. And what then is any single life measured against the turning of all that? It was a thoughtful letter, a kind letter, and one senses that Sulpicius wrote it with real difficulty and real love. Whether it helped, it is hard to say. Cicero thanked him for it, and thanked others who wrote, and acknowledged that he knew, in the rational part of himself, that all these things were true, and that sorrow passes, and that the world continues. And then he went on grieving anyway, because knowing something and feeling it are two quite separate rooms, and philosophy, however beautiful, does not always hold the key between them. What he did in his grief, and this is the part that still astonishes in its strange, driven, almost desperate quality, was right. He wrote enormously, almost frantically, as though words were both the wound and the bandage. He began composing a text he called the Consolatio, a work of philosophical mourning, addressed to himself, drawing on the Greek tradition of consolation literature, and weaving into it his own anguish and his own attempts to reason his way through it. This work, sadly, has not survived in complete form. Only fragments and echoes remain, quoted here and there by later writers, but what we can reconstruct of it suggests something raw and remarkable, a man trying to use the full apparatus of his training and his learning to climb out of a grief that did not want to be climbed out of. He also, it is said, conceived a plan that tells us something profound about how he understood love and loss and memory. He wanted to build a shrine to Tullia, not simply a tomb, but something more like a temple, a sacred space dedicated to her, in which she might be consecrated almost as a divine figure. He wrote about this plan in his letters with real seriousness, consulting friends about suitable sites, thinking carefully about the architecture, about what such a place should feel like. The project was never completed, as far as we know, perhaps because the practical difficulties were insurmountable, perhaps because grief itself shifted shape as the months passed. But the impulse behind it tells us everything. He wanted her to be remembered not just privately, not just in his own heart, but in stone, in a form the light could fall upon, in a place where someone standing very still might feel something of what she had been. Through all of this, through the letter writing and the sleepless nights, and the philosophical drafts and the imagined shrine, the sound of water persisted around him at Astura, the sea moving against the island's edges, the quiet lap and shift of it, the world going on in its ancient indifferent rhythms, while one man sat among his books and tried to find a language adequate to loss. What came out of this period was not only grief, but philosophy, some of the most enduring philosophy Cicero would ever produce. The Tusculan Disputations, the work known as De Finibus, the treatise on the nature of the gods, these large, patient, searching works on how human beings ought to live and what they ought to seek and what, if anything, awaits us when the lamp goes out. All of these emerged in the months following Tullia's death, and they are marked by something that his earlier writings sometimes lacked, a quality of personal urgency, of a man who is not merely constructing elegant arguments, but actually needing the answers, actually reaching for them in the dark. He wrote in the Tusculan Disputations about learning to face death without fear, about the life of the mind as the most durable form of human flourishing, about what the philosophers of Greece had said across centuries about the soul and its destination. He wrote with clarity and with beauty and with a kind of controlled passion that is all the more moving when one knows the context in which the words were set down. The winter light, the coastal island, the absence beside him that had no name adequate to it. There is something almost paradoxical in this, and Cicero himself may have felt it, that the deepest sorrow of his life produced some of his most luminous thinking. Grief became a kind of lens through which the questions that had always interested him, what is a good life, what is virtue, what do we owe each other, what is the soul, suddenly appeared not as intellectual exercises, but as urgent living necessities. He was depending on them. And so the months at Astura passed, and the letters went back and forth across the miles between the coast and Rome, and the sea continued its patient work against the shore, and Cicero, grieving and writing and grieving again, produced in his anguish a body of work that would outlast the grief, and outlast him, and outlast the very civilization that had formed both of them. He returned eventually to Rome. He returned to public life, to political anxiety, to the long, difficult maneuvering of a world that was changing around him in ways he could not fully control. But something had shifted. There was, from this point on, a quality in his writing that one might call wisdom, if that word were not so easily overused, a sense of a man who has looked at the darkest thing and not looked away, and who has come back from it carrying very carefully the few small lights that the darkness allowed him to find. In the chapters ahead, we will find him turning those lights toward his work, setting down on papyrus the ideas that he hoped would persist long after marble crumbled and empires fell, the quiet, enduring labor of an aging mind that had learned through sorrow what it most wanted to say. For now, let the sea settle around you, and the winter light go pale, and let sleep come in gently, the way it always does, when grief has done its slow and necessary work. The lamp had burned low by the time the last servant retired for the evening, and in the quietest room of the villa at Tusculum, the scratching of a stylus continued long after the rest of the household had surrendered to sleep. There was no urgency in that sound, or rather the urgency was of a particular and private kind, not the frantic scratching of a man racing toward a deadline, but the slower, more deliberate mark-making of someone who understood, somewhere beneath the surface of conscious thought, that the words being set down now might outlast almost everything else he had known. The lamp threw its soft amber light across the papyrus, across the careful Latin lines taking shape in the stillness, and outside the Alban hills were dark and very quiet, and the night air that drifted through the open window carried the faint green smell of cypress and damp earth, and the particular sweetness that the Italian countryside offers only in the deepest hours, when the world has finally agreed to be still. This was the Cicero that history sometimes forgets in its fascination with the advocate, the consul, the exile, the politician threading his careful way through impossible rooms. This was the Cicero of the study, the Cicero who sat alone with a lamp and a lifetime of reading, and a mind that had never, not once, been content simply to observe the world, without also attempting to understand it and arrange it and pass it on. And what he was passing on in these later years was something considerable, a body of work in Latin philosophy and rhetoric that had simply not existed before him, or had existed only in fragments and borrowings, scattered and unformed, waiting for someone to gather it up and give it a shape that Roman readers could hold in their hands and recognize as their own. It is perhaps worth pausing here in the lamplight to consider what it meant to write philosophy in Latin in the final decades of the Republic. Greek was the language of thought, as educated Romans of the period would have readily acknowledged, sometimes with pride, sometimes with a faint defensiveness. The great schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans and the academics and the Peripatetics, had all conducted their most serious business in Greek, and a cultivated Roman who wished to read Plato or Aristotle or Chrysippus read them in the original, or not at all. Cicero had done precisely that, in Athens and in Rhodes, and in the libraries of his own collection, and he carried those ideas inside him the way a traveler carries stones gathered from a distant shore. not as exhibits, but as weights that shift and settle and become, over time, simply part of how one moves through the world. What Cicero understood, and what gave his later writing its particular quality of mission, was that philosophy conducted only in Greek would remain forever a foreign import in the Roman mind, admired perhaps the way one admires a beautiful piece of furniture made in another country, but never quite felt in the bones. He wished to make these ideas native. He wished to demonstrate that the Latin tongue was supple enough, deep enough, dignified enough to bear the full weight of questions about the good life, the just state, the nature of the gods, the consolations available to a soul in grief. And so he sat at his lamplit desk and he wrote, and in writing he was doing something that no one before him had done with quite such ambition or such grace. The work that bears the name De Republica, on the Republic, on the state, on the nature of the Commonwealth, came from an earlier period of his creative life, composed, it is thought, during the years when Caesar's growing shadow had begun to change the temperature of public life, when Cicero found himself with more time for reflection than he would perhaps have chosen. He cast it as a dialogue in the manner of Plato, setting his conversation among the great Romans of an earlier generation, Scipio Africanus the younger in his circle, so that the questions being asked about the best form of government might carry the weight of Roman tradition as well as Greek philosophy. What is the ideal state, and who should lead it? What obligations bind citizens to one another and to the whole? The answers Cicero offered were characteristically Roman in their emphasis on law, on historical precedent, on the kind of mixed constitution that distributes power without surrendering order, and characteristically his own in the way they kept circling back to the figure of the statesman, the man of learning and virtue, who serves not from ambition but from a genuine love of the common good. One can hear, beneath the philosophical architecture, the sound of a man describing the kind of leader he had always hoped to be, and sometimes believed himself to be, and sometimes doubted. The Tusculan disputations carry a different kind of atmosphere, quieter, more inward, more tender, in a way that the consolatory tradition of ancient philosophy often is. They take their name from the villa that Cicero loved above all his properties, the place where the lamp burned longest and the library shelves stood most densely packed. And they address themselves to questions of the suffering mind with a directness that suggests something more than academic interest. How should a philosopher regard death? How should the wise person bear pain? Is virtue sufficient for happiness, even in the most terrible circumstances? These were not idle questions in the years that produced them. Cicero had buried his daughter. He had watched the republic he loved bend and crack under forces he could neither control nor fully comprehend. He had known exile, and he had known the strange, particular grief of returning to find that the city one loves has continued perfectly well in one's absence. The Tusculan disputations moved through these territories with a kind of composed deliberateness, marshalling Greek wisdom and Roman example in service of something that resembles, in its deepest register, self-persuasion, the philosopher arguing himself, gently and at length, into a state of equanimity that perhaps did not come entirely naturally. And then there is De Officiis, on duties, on obligations, on the moral architecture of a life well lived, which came last of the major works, composed in a single extraordinary burst during the months following Caesar's assassination, when Cicero was writing partly to give himself something to do with his hands, while the world rearranged itself around him. He addressed it to his son Marcus, who was studying in Athens, and that personal frame gives the whole work a warmth that pure philosophical treatise does not always achieve. A father speaking to a son, trying to pass on what he has learned, trying to distill 60 years of reading and advocacy and political life and grief and friendship into something that might be carried forward. This is the human music audible beneath the Latin periods, and it gives De Officiis a quality that readers across many subsequent centuries found they could not quite put down. What do we owe one another? How do we navigate the inevitable tensions between what is honorable and what is expedient? How does a person of principle survive in a world that does not always reward principle? These are questions that did not age, and Cicero knew they would not age, and it is said that he wrote with something approaching serenity during those months, as if the act of writing had become its own sufficient consolation. What he hoped to leave behind, and here one walks carefully, because the inner life of any mind 2,000 years distant can only be glimpsed through the amber of what that mind chose to write down, was something like a Roman philosophy, a tradition of moral and political reflection conducted in the Latin tongue, rooted in the Roman experience, answerable to Roman ideals of civic virtue and the active life, and yet enriched by the full depth of Greek thought. He wanted future Romans to be able to think seriously about serious things in their own language, without apology, without the slight cultural deference that reaching always for a Greek text implies. Whether he succeeded may be measured in some small part by the fact that we are still speaking of these books, still finding their questions alive, and their sentences worth reading aloud for the sheer pleasure of how they fall upon the ear. The lamp at Tusculum burned, and the stylus moved, and the night deepened around the villa on its hillside. And perhaps in those quiet hours, Cicero was as close to contented as a man of his temperament ever came, not because his life had been peaceful or his losses small, but because the work under his hand was real and lasting, and his, in a way that no political office had ever quite managed to be. The words were not subject to a vote. The words could not be exiled, and outside, as always, the hills were dark, and the air was cool, and the lamp's small flame held steady in the stillness, burning on. In the days and months beyond those quiet writing hours, the world would not remain still for long. The death of Caesar had opened doors that no single voice, however eloquent, could easily close again, and Cicero, who had always chosen words over swords, was preparing with characteristic courage and characteristic anxiety for one more great contest. But that can wait for another evening, and for now there is only the lamp, the night air, and the long, comfortable silence of a story settling gently into rest. The fire in the hearth at Tusculum had burned low by the time the messenger arrived, and Cicero, who had been reading by its warmth, set down his scroll and listened to the words that changed everything. Words that had already, by the time they reached him, changed the world. It was in the 49th year before the birth of Christ, deep in the cold heart of a January night, that Julius Caesar led his soldiers across a narrow river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. The river itself was modest, a shallow, unremarkable thing that wound through the flat Cisalpine plain, its banks fringed with winter reeds, its surface dark and quietly moving beneath a sky that had no interest in the magnitude of what was happening. And yet that crossing, a single general with a single legion stepping over a boundary that Roman law said no armed commander should cross, was the sound of the Republic cracking along a fault line that had been deepening for decades. The fire of that moment would travel south through Italy like a breath through dry grass, and by the time it reached Cicero's study on the Alban Hills, everything he had spent his life preserving had already begun to change its shape. He had known Caesar, of course. One does not spend 50 years at the heart of Roman public life without knowing Julius Caesar. They had circled each other for years, like two very different planets following orbits that occasionally brought them into conjunction, cordial, mutually respectful, never quite at ease. Caesar was everything Cicero was not in temperament, swift where Cicero deliberated, bold where Cicero calculated, magnetic in a way that owed nothing to argument and everything to presence. Cicero had always preferred the slow architecture of a well-made speech to the sudden drama of a well-timed sword, and Caesar had always understood, with that cool intelligence of his, that Cicero's pen was not something to be made into an enemy if it could instead be made into a friend. There had been letters between them, warm letters, surprisingly warm, and invitations extended and occasionally accepted. It is said that Caesar once told someone he admired Cicero more than a triumphant general, because Cicero had extended the boundaries not of Roman territory, but of Roman genius. Whether or not those words were truly spoken, they survive in the amber of history because they feel like something Caesar might have said, and because they are the kind of thing Cicero would have wanted to believe. But admiration and trust are different countries, and Cicero had always known he could not quite trust the man, not because Caesar was dishonest in the ordinary sense. He was, if anything, startlingly frank about his ambitions, but because his ambitions led somewhere that Cicero could not follow without abandoning everything he believed about how a republic ought to breathe. Caesar wanted power concentrated, streamlined, made efficient. Cicero wanted power dispersed, debated, shared among the many voices of the Senate, checked and balanced and slowed by the friction of procedure. These were not reconcilable visions, and both men knew it, and they continued to dine together and exchange elegant letters anyway, because that is also something Rome did very well. The years of Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, those long 9 years of conquest in the cold and forested north, had been years of peculiar suspension for Cicero. He watched from Rome, and then from Tusculum, and then from various villas along the Italian coast, as Caesar grew larger in the imagination of the Roman people, with every dispatched report of another barbarian army defeated, another tribe brought under the Roman peace, another river crossed, and river god presumably appalled. The soldiers loved Caesar with the simple, fierce love that soldiers give to a general who feeds them and wins for them and remembers their names. The people of Rome loved him with the less discriminating love that crowds give to someone who is always victorious and always interesting. And the Senate, the great, slow, quarrelsome Senate that Cicero loved as a man loves a difficult but irreplaceable parent, watched Caesar's returning shadow with mounting unease that it could not quite decide how to act upon. Cicero spent those years writing. He wrote philosophy and rhetoric and letters, so many letters, to so many people, in that warm and honest prose that still somehow surprises us when we encounter it, because it sounds like a living voice rather than an ancient document. He wrote to his friend Atticus almost daily, those intimate dispatches that were never meant for posterity, but have become, by some gift of accident, among the most revealing windows into any mind the ancient world left us. He wrote about his garden and his health and the price of marble and his worries about his daughter Tullia and his growing unease about the direction of Roman politics, all of it mixed together in the beautiful, unbothered way that private letters mix the enormous and the trivial when no one is watching. The fire in whatever room he was working in cast its warm light across the page, and outside, Rome continued its business, and somewhere to the north, Caesar continued his. When the crossing of the Rubicon came, Cicero found himself in one of the most agonizing positions that an intelligent man of principle can occupy. He could see clearly what was happening, he understood its implications with painful precision, and he was nearly powerless to effect it. His old enemy Pompey, who was himself no simple defender of the Republic, having spent years accumulating extraordinary powers of his own, had become, by strange necessity, the Senate's champion against Caesar. Pompey was the alternative, and Pompey was deeply imperfect, and Cicero knew this with the weary lucidity of a man who had watched Roman politics long enough to be under no illusions about any of its actors. He wrote to Atticus of his dilemma in terms that still ache with their honesty. He could see no good outcome, only better and worse ones, and he was not sure he could identify which was which. He joined Pompey. It is said he did so reluctantly, almost mournfully, traveling south and then east to where Pompey's forces were gathering, feeling in his bones that he was boarding a ship whose captain was skilled, but whose course was already set toward rocks. He was not well. He was seasick on the actual sea voyage and heartsick on a deeper level that no amount of rest could address. When he reached Pompey's camp in Greece and looked around at the collected forces of the Republican cause, generals and senators and their followers, proud and squabbling and confident in ways that Cicero found difficult to share, he felt something that his letters described as a kind of hollow grief, the grief of a man watching a beautiful old building being shaken by forces it was never designed to resist. The Battle of Pharsalus, in the summer of 48 years before the birth of Christ, settled the question that the crossing of the Rubicon had posed. Pompey's forces were broken. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was killed on a beach, in circumstances that Cicero, when he heard of them, could not bring himself to dwell upon. The Republic's champion was gone, and Caesar stood at the summit of the Roman world. And Cicero sailed back to Italy and waited on the coast at Brundisium for many months, in a state of political limbo so complete, it was almost like one of those dreams in which you stand in a familiar place and find that none of the doors open anymore. Caesar, when he returned and eventually passed through Italy, treated Cicero with the courtesy of a victor who understood that cruelty was poor policy and that Cicero's pen was better kept grateful than aggrieved. He received him kindly. He restored him to something resembling normal life. And Cicero, who had no army and no army's prospects and no wish for martyrdom, returned to his books and his villa and his writing, and tried to find in philosophy the stability that politics could no longer offer. He wrote and translated and thought and walked in his garden. And the fire in the evening was the same fire it had always been, and the stars above Tusculum were indifferent, as stars reliably are, to the reorganization of human power below them. He was not defeated exactly. He was suspended. He was a man of words in an age that had chosen definitively the word of one man over the many, and he was doing what such men do when the forum is no longer available to them. He was writing everything down, as carefully and as fully as he could, against some future hour when words might matter again. That hour, it turned out, was not far away, and when it came it would arrive wearing the particular dark garment that March wears in the Roman calendar, and it would change everything once more. And Cicero, resting now in his study, his fire burning low, would feel its approach the way one feels a change in the weather, not yet here, but coming, unmistakably coming, through the quiet Italian dark. The torches along the Palatine had burned low by the time the news reached him. It is worth pausing there for a moment, in that particular stillness, because the night before the Ides of March in the year 710 from the founding of the city, 44 years before the birth of Christ, was simply an ordinary night in Rome. Fires burned in their braziers, the Tiber moved along its ancient course, with its low, familiar murmur. Somewhere in the city, a dog barked once, and then fell quiet. The world did not announce itself. The world never does in those last hours before everything changes. Cicero was in Rome that winter and spring, moving through the city with the careful, watchful tread of a man who has learned to take up very little space. The years of Caesar's dominance had taught him that particular skill. He attended dinners when he was invited. He smiled at the right moments. He wrote letters in the hours before dawn, long letters to Atticus, full of wry observation and barely suppressed misery, letters in which the word libertas appeared again and again, like a man pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurts. He knew something was stirring among certain men. He had spoken with Brutus. He had felt in the way that someone attuned to the currents of a city feels things, that a decision was being made somewhere in rooms he was not quite invited into. The story goes, and the ancient sources are careful here, that Cicero was not among the conspirators. He was not told. The men who gathered under the quiet, deliberate leadership of Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus seemed to have made a considered choice to leave the great orator outside their confidence. Perhaps they feared his caution, perhaps they feared even more his tongue. A secret shared with Cicero was a secret that would eventually become a sentence, and sentences, as everyone in Rome understood, had a way of traveling. And so on the morning of the 15th of March, Cicero went about his day, not knowing what was about to happen in the theater of Pompey, where the Senate had gathered to meet, and where Julius Caesar, dictator perpetuo, was about to sit down for the last time. What happened in that chamber is known well enough that it has become, across the centuries, almost mythological in its shape. Caesar arrived, the conspirators gathered close, the petitions were offered as a pretense, and then the knives came out. 23 wounds, the ancient sources agree, though it is said that only one of them was truly fatal, and that many of the men in that close, desperate circle in their panic and confusion wounded one another as much as Caesar. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old rival, his old enemy, and the man he had defeated in a civil war that had cost Rome more than it knew how to count. It is a detail so perfectly arranged by the indifferent geometry of history that it has always seemed almost impossible to believe. And yet there it is. The conspirators emerged into the streets calling out for liberty, for the republic, for the old order of things, and the streets gave them back nothing but silence. Rome did not rise to greet them. The people of the city, the ordinary men and women who carried water and sold bread and argued at the counters of taverns, did not know what had happened or what it meant, and in their uncertainty they simply went still and waited, which is what people do when the world shifts beneath them and there is nothing solid to stand on yet. Cicero received the news the way a man receives news he has been half expecting without quite knowing it. There are several accounts of his movements in those first hours, and they agree on one broad truth: not with grief for Caesar. His feelings about Caesar were complicated, tender in the personal sense, corrosive in the political one. but with something closer to a terrible, soaring, trembling hope. He wrote to Atticus in language barely contained by the usual elegance of his letters. He used the word he had been pressing on for years, libertas, liberty. He believed in those first luminous and bewildering hours that the Republic had been given back to itself. He was at the meeting of the Senate 2 days later, and it was Cicero who spoke first for what might be called a policy of amnesty and forward motion. Let the past be the past. Let the conspirators go unpunished. Let Rome breathe. It was the pragmatism of a man who had lived through enough Roman violence to know that punishment breeds reprisal breeds punishment in a circle that only exhausts itself in rivers of blood. The Senate, in its stunned and uncertain state, largely agreed. It seemed for a brief and quiet moment as though the middle path might hold. But Marcus Antonius was still alive, and Marcus Antonius was not a man inclined toward middle paths. Caesar's chief lieutenant, the man known to history as Mark Antony, moved through the days after the Ides with a stillness that Cicero found more unnerving than any outright hostility. He secured Caesar's papers. He took control of Caesar's household and treasury. He arranged for the public funeral, and it was at that funeral, standing before the weeping crowds of Rome with Caesar's bloody toga in his hands, that Antony transformed a political crisis into something much older and more dangerous, a grief, a rage, a demand. The crowds who listened to Antony speak over Caesar's body did not go home and reflect quietly on constitutional principle. They went into the streets, they burned, they frightened the conspirators into leaving Rome, and one by one, Brutus and Cassius and the others departed the city they had believed they were saving, and found themselves instead simply running. Cicero watched all of this with the eyes of a man who has seen the same machinery operate before and cannot stop it, and cannot quite look away. He wrote to Atticus that the liberators, as he called them, and his affection for Brutus was deep and genuine and colored everything he thought in those weeks, had possessed the courage of men but the planning of boys. The deed had been done without any thought of what came after the deed. They had removed a king, as they saw it, and then stood blinking in the light, with no more idea of what to build in the empty space than a child who has knocked over a tower of blocks. He retreated for a time. The summer of that year found him moving between his villas, at Tusculum, at Puteoli, at Astura near the sea, writing letters and being written to, watching from a careful distance as Rome began the slow, terrible process of deciding who would replace Caesar. There was Antony, moving with increasing arrogance through the machinery of power. There was Lepidus, careful and calculating, and then there arrived from the east a young man of 19, slight and serious, and bearing the name that Caesar had left him in his will, Gaius Octavius, who had taken the name Caesar and would one day take the name Augustus, and who was perhaps the most dangerous political intelligence of his generation, dressed in the body of a boy who still looked as though he might be studying rhetoric. Cicero met him. Cicero was charmed by him in the way that clever older men are sometimes charmed by clever younger men, finding in them a flattering reflection of their own sharpness. He wrote to Atticus with cautious warmth about the boy. He began to form a thought, the thought of a man who had spent his whole life trying to find the lever that would restore balance to a tilting world. Perhaps Octavian could be used. Perhaps this young man, hungry for legitimate authority, could be allied against Antony, elevated just high enough to check the general's ambitions. And then, and here the thought had a confidence to it that the subsequent centuries would find poignant, guided by the wisdom of the Senate and its elder statesmen. It was not a foolish plan. It was, by the cold logic of Roman politics, as Cicero had learned it, a reasonable one. It was simply a plan made by a man who understood the Republic and could not quite bring himself to believe that the Republic was already past understanding. He was 62 years old. He had been quaestor and praetor and consul. He had saved Rome once, or believed he had paid for that belief with years of exile and grief and grinding uncertainty. And now he was standing again at the edge of the forum, looking out at a Rome that needed a voice, and he found that the voice was still there, still warm, still capable of that particular music that had always moved men whether they wanted to be moved or not. He made his choice. He stepped forward. He took up his pen and then his place and began to speak. The sea, not far from where he had spent those quiet weeks of anxious watching, went on making its ancient sound against the shore, indifferent and enduring, the way the sea always does when men decide that words are worth more than safety. The lamps were burning low across the city, as they so often burned in those uncertain months after Caesar's death, when Rome seemed to hold its breath between one kind of world and another, not yet knowing what shape the next would take. In the houses of senators, in the colonnaded libraries of men who still believed that words and argument could hold a civilization together, small flames guttered and steadied, casting long shadows across papyrus rolls and wax tablets, and the anxious faces of men who read and reread the same dispatches, trying to understand what was coming. Cicero was among them. He was 62 years old now, and the months since the Ides of March had been a kind of fever dream, a dizzying succession of hope and disappointment and recalibration. He had been almost radiant in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, writing to friends with something approaching joy, speaking of a republic restored, of old liberties breathing again. And then, slowly, the reality had settled around him like cold air entering a room whose fire has died. Mark Antony was still there. Mark Antony was in fact growing larger by the day. Marcus Antonius was not a man who lacked ability. Let us be clear about that as we settle into this quiet hour, because the story is more interesting and more honest if we see him whole. He was capable, charismatic, experienced in command, possessed of a soldier's directness and a politician's instinct for opportunity. But in Cicero's eyes, and in the eyes of many who had spent their lives defending the idea of the Senate's sovereignty, Antony represented something dangerous, the same appetite for singular power that had consumed Caesar, now wearing a different face, and advancing without Caesar's philosophical pretensions or his genuine brilliance to soften it. What Cicero chose to do in the autumn of the 43rd year before the birth of Christ, and into the early months that followed, was to speak, to write and to speak, which had always been for him the same thing drawn from the same source. He composed a series of speeches against Antony, 14 of them in all, as the count eventually stood, though not all were delivered aloud before an audience, and some were circulated as written texts to be read across the Roman world. He called them, borrowing from his beloved Greek past, his Philippics, naming them after the speeches Demosthenes of Athens had delivered against Philip of Macedon more than 3 centuries before. It was a deliberate, knowing choice, the kind of historical echo that Cicero could not resist, and it situated him consciously in a line of men who had stood before encroaching power and refused to be silent. The first Philippic was careful, measured by his standards, almost gentle in its criticism. He rose in the Senate on a mild September day, the light coming in at the angles it takes in early autumn, and he chose not to attack Antony directly, so much as to question, to probe, to suggest that certain decisions were unwise, that certain precedents were dangerous. It was the speech of a man feeling his way, testing the temperature of the room, listening to what the silence between sentences was telling him. Antony was furious even at that. He responded with a ferocious speech of his own, accusing Cicero of ingratitude, of treachery, of having engineered the very death of Caesar. The gloves, as it were off, and then Cicero retreated briefly to his country estates and wrote. He wrote the second Philippic, which is perhaps the most extraordinary piece of political invective to survive from the ancient world, a document so scalding, so elaborately constructed, so brilliantly savage in its details, that it was never actually delivered as a speech at all. It was written, copied, circulated quietly among trusted readers, allowed to spread through the reading classes of Rome like ink through water. It is said that Cicero himself knew delivering it in person might be the last thing he ever did. He was brave, but he was not reckless with his life, not yet. In it, he catalogued what he presented as Antony's vices, his supposed drunkenness and licentiousness in youth, his misuse of public funds, his manipulation of Caesar's legacy, his threats against the Senate's freedom. It was a portrait painted with all the colors of contempt, but contempt that was organized and argued and footnoted with the habits of a mind trained for 40 years in the art of persuasion. Through the winter, the speeches continued, Some were delivered, some circulated in writing, some existed somewhere between the two. Cicero aligned himself with young Octavian, Caesar's heir, whom he somewhat miscalculated as a tool he could manage and direct, a young man whose apparent deference to senatorial authority seemed, to the aging orator, like a promising sign. It is said that Cicero wrote to a friend that they could praise the young man, use him, and then set him aside. That calculation would prove to be one of the most consequential misjudgments of his long political life. But in those winter months, it sustained him, gave him the feeling that he was not entirely alone, that the Republic still had defenders with swords as well as voices. The third, fourth, fifth Philippics built upon each other like courses of stone, each one rising from the last. By the fifth, Cicero was calling for war against Antony openly. By the sixth and seventh, he was trying to manage the Senate's mood between those who wanted negotiation and those who wanted decisive action, threading the needle of argument with the skill of a man who had been doing exactly this for 3 decades. And all the while the lamps burned, in his study at Rome, in the borrowed rooms of friends, in the houses of senators who read his words by night and passed them to their neighbors by morning. There is a quality to the Philippics that goes beyond political argument, if one sits with them long enough and allows oneself to hear the voice beneath the rhetoric. There is something almost elegiac in them, a quality of a man who knows, at some level he may not have fully acknowledged, that he is spending something finite, drawing down a reserve of courage that will not be replenished. He had been afraid before, during the Catilinarian crisis, during the exile, during the terrifying uncertainty of the civil wars. But this was different. This was a man in his 7th decade, with aching joints and a grief for his daughter that had never fully healed, choosing to stand in the open and say, clearly and at length, that this man, this powerful, well-armed popular man, is a threat to everything Rome has meant and should mean. Come and answer me if you dare. The later Philippics, the 9th through to the 14th, grew sharper and more urgent as the military situation shifted and turned, as the consuls Antony faced at Mutina fell, as Octavian maneuvered in ways that began to suggest he was not quite the compliant young ally Cicero had imagined. The 12th and 13th have a quality of controlled desperation to them, the words of someone who can feel the ground moving beneath his feet, but who will not, on that account, stop arguing. The 14th was written in the late winter or early spring, as best the scholars can determine, and by then the shape of what was coming was becoming visible, even through the ordinary optimism that Cicero always, somehow, managed to maintain. He had given Rome 14 speeches. He had given it across a long lifetime, hundreds of speeches, dozens of philosophical works, an uncountable flood of letters, a philosophy of government and of human duty that would outlast every army that marched through the gates of the city he loved. He had argued and persuaded, and lost and won and argued again, and now here, in this last great effort, he was arguing one more time, with everything he had, for the idea that power must be accountable and speech must be free, and that a republic, even a wounded, complicated, imperfect republic like Rome, was worth defending with the only weapons he knew how to use. The lamps in his study burned as they always had, steady and still air, trembling when a draft moved through, casting light on the pages that his secretaries would copy and copy again, until his words reached every corner of the Roman world that could still read and still cared what a man had to say. He could not have known, not quite, how little time remained between those burning lamps and the dark. But perhaps some part of him, the part that had always read the room with such devastating accuracy, had already begun to understand that the road ahead would be shorter than he wished, and would end somewhere out in the open country, among the sounds of the sea and the wind moving through the old Italian trees. That road, and what waited at its end, is where we will travel together next, gently, without haste, when you are ready to rest a little deeper and listen a little longer. For now, let the lamp flame find its stillness, let the words settle around you like leaves coming slowly down. The road south from Rome was dusty in those December days, and the light that fell across it was the thin, pale light of a season turning toward its coldest point, the sun low and amber even at midday, casting long shadows from the roadside pines, then stretched ahead like fingers pointing the traveler onward, always onward toward the coast. Cicero had left the city before, of course. He knew what it was to move through the countryside with grief sitting beside him in the carriage, with uncertainty spread across the road ahead like morning mist. He had done it once before in bitterness and shame, driven out by the machinery of men who hated what he represented. But this departure, in the final weeks of the year that we might call 43 years before the birth of Christ, was different in a way that the body understands before the mind is willing to admit it. This was not exile. This was something older and quieter than exile. This was a man at the end of a road, being carried gently along its final miles without quite knowing, or perhaps knowing too well, that the miles were few. He was 63 years old, not ancient, not broken, but worn in the way that men are worn when they have spent the better part of 4 decades in the forge of public life, when they have been raised up and cast down and raised again and cast down once more, when they have loved deeply and lost what they loved, when they have written in candlelight through more nights than could be counted, and spoken in the open air of the forum, on mornings when their voice carried across thousands of upturned faces. He was a man whose instrument had been language, and he had played it without rest, and now the world around him had grown loud with a different kind of instrument entirely, the kind that does not argue or persuade, but simply silences. The Philippics had sealed it. His great speeches against Marcus Antonius, delivered with all the fire that a man of 63 years could still summon, had named him as an enemy to those who were consolidating power in Rome. The second triumvirate, Antonius and Octavian and Lepidus, had drawn up their lists of proscription in the cold pragmatism that such men always use, setting aside sentiment the way one sets aside a coat that no longer fits. And the name of Marcus Tullius Cicero had been placed upon those lists with a finality that left no room for appeals, no space for one more speech, no rostrum on which a man might stand and make his case. And so he left. His freedman Tiro, faithful and devoted across so many decades, was not with him on this final journey, though the story goes that Tiro survived his master and lived to a great age, carrying the weight of his grief into a long and quiet old age. Others attended Cicero on the road, servants and friends who moved with him from one estate to another, trying to determine which direction offered the greatest safety, debating whether he might reach a port and sail to Macedonia, whether the sea might swallow him gently into its protection, the way it sometimes seems to offer itself as a remedy to those the land has made unwelcome. He reached his estate at Tusculum first, that beloved house among the hills where he had written so much, where the sound of wind through the garden had accompanied the composition of the Tusculan disputations and 100 letters and philosophical reflections that had poured from him in the years since Tullius' death. He is said to have walked through the house quietly, touching the familiar things the way a person does when they are not certain they will see them again. Then he moved on southward toward his villa at Formiae, near the sea, that long, blue, reliable presence at the edge of the Italian world, the sea that had always been there, indifferent and enormous and enduring in the way that only water can be. At Formiae he rested for a time, and the ancient sources tell us that he was uncertain, that he deliberated with himself and with those around him about whether to continue, about what could yet be done, about whether there was still some path that opened rather than closed. He had always been a man who deliberated, who turned a question over in his mind the way one turns a stone to see what lives beneath it. It was how his mind worked, slowly, carefully, always reaching for the argument that would hold, the position that would bear the weight of scrutiny. But the world around him was no longer interested in scrutiny. It had made its decision. The soldiers came, or rather, they were sent, dispatched by those whose instructions flowed from Antonius himself, if the sources are to be believed. There is some debate among those who have studied these events as to the precise sequence, as to whether Cicero attempted to flee by sea and was turned back by contrary winds, or whether he had already resolved something within himself, and was, in the manner of certain men of a philosophical disposition, simply waiting. What the ancient writers agree upon is the quality of stillness at the end, a stillness that reads not as resignation in the despairing sense, but as something more composed, a man who has reached the boundary of what he can do and who stands there without flinching. It is said that when the soldiers found him, he was being carried in his litter, and that he looked out at them with a calmness that struck those who witnessed it as remarkable. Plutarch, writing a century and more later, tells us that Cicero stretched his neck forward himself, that he helped them with the task that had been assigned to them, and though one must hold all such specific details lightly, understanding that writers across the ancient world were not above giving a noble death its noble gestures, the general impression the sources leave is of a man who had chosen the manner of his ending as surely as he had once chosen the words of his speeches, with deliberateness, with a kind of dark dignity. He died near the sea, which had always been there, the light on that December day, and it was the 7th day of that last December of his life, according to those who kept count, would have been the same low amber light that had accompanied his whole journey south, the winter sun offering what warmth it could, which was little, which was the pale warmth of a season that gives sparingly and keeps most of its light for itself. The head and hands were taken, as was the custom under proscription, and brought to Rome, and the ancient sources do not spare us the knowledge of what was done with them, how they were displayed in the forum, from the very rostra where Cicero had spoken so many times, a cruelty so precisely calibrated to the man that it suggests a personal fury behind it, an anger at the voice itself, at the instrument, at the words that had refused to stop coming, even when every sensible calculation said they should. Antony's wife Fulvia is said by some writers to have stabbed the tongue with a hairpin. This story may be embellished, may be a later addition to the tradition, offered to make the hatred of Cicero's enemies feel as complete and theatrical as Roman audiences expected dramatic stories to be. But, whether the detail is literally true or not, it speaks to something true in its way about what Cicero represented to those who feared the power of his language, that his tongue was the weapon, the instrument, the thing that had to be answered. What is certain is that the sea was there, as it had always been, taking no sides, moving in its slow, rhythmic way against the Italian coast, carrying its salt air inland across the winter fields, indifferent to emperors and consuls, to prescription lists and the titles of triumvirs, to the great political engines of the human world that grind so loudly for a generation and then fall quiet. The sea simply continued, as water does, as the sound of it does in the dark hours before sleep, steady and ongoing and entirely without end. And so we leave him here, gently, near the water he would have heard on that last morning, in the pale gold of a winter sun that gave what light it could. There is still one more chapter to come, a soft and unhurried one, a chapter not of ending but of echo, following the long, slow life of Cicero's words, through the centuries that came after, hearing how they moved through darkness and emerged again into the light. But that chapter is waiting for you, and it requires nothing more of you tonight except rest, and perhaps a little of the peace that comes from having listened this far. The road through the hills above Arpinum is quiet now. The afternoon light that once fell across those limestone slopes, warming the grasses and the old stone walls, has softened into something gentler, something the color of honey left too long in the jar. And if you were to stand there in the stillness and let your eyes close, you might almost hear it, the sound of the Fabreno River moving over its stones below, patient and unhurried as it has always been, carrying the cold water of the mountains down toward the valley and the wider world beyond. It is the same river that ran beneath the childhood windows of a boy who would one day fill the entire Roman world with the sound of his voice. And now, at the end of our long journey together, we return to it, not to begin again, but to rest and to remember. We have traveled a very great distance, you and I. We have walked the streets of late Republican Rome at dusk, felt the press of the forum crowd, smelled the bread and the torch smoke, and the warm stone of temples that have long since crumbled into earth. We have sat in the shadow of Greek philosophers on the island of Rhodes, have climbed the slow ladder of Roman honor rung by careful rung, have stood in the comitia and heard a voice rise above the noise of the city and say something so precisely, so devastatingly true, that the crowd fell quiet the way a crowd only falls quiet when it recognizes itself in the words being spoken to it. We have walked with Cicero through triumph and through grief, through the consulship that made him, through the exile that nearly broke him, through the death of a daughter whose absence he could not fill with all the philosophy in the world, and we have followed him at last down a final road toward the sea, where the litter stopped and the voice that had shaped a civilization fell quiet. but voices like his do not simply disappear. That is the remarkable thing, and it is worth sitting with for a little while before you let yourself drift into sleep. When the soldiers came for him on that December day, 63 years before the birth of Christ having run their long count forward into winter, the republic he loved already dying around him, its institutions hollowed out, its old certainties dismantled one by one, Cicero was 63 years old, tired and grieving, and yet the story goes that he met that ending with something approaching stillness. He had said what he needed to say. He had written it down, he had sent the words out into the world in every form available to him, as speeches, as letters, as philosophical treatises, as dialogues modeled on the Greeks he so admired. And whatever else those final hours contained, the words themselves were already beyond the reach of any soldier, any triumvir, any empire. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in the 106th year before the birth of Christ, in a small hill town that did not expect to produce anyone of consequence. The son of an equestrian family with modest means and immodest ambitions for their eldest boy, he came to Rome as a young man with a talent so obvious that even those who disliked him could not deny it. Studied with a ferocity that left him frail and exhausted in his 20s, and then stood up in a Roman courtroom and defended a man accused of parricide against the most powerful political forces of the day. And won. That was the moment Rome looked up and took notice of a thin young man from the hills, and Rome would never quite stop looking at him after that. He rose through every office the Republic offered, serving in Sicily as quaestor, walking those ancient grain-rich roads we have passed through together, and then climbing onward, praetor, consul, reaching in his 43rd year the summit of Roman public life, the office that two men held jointly for a single year at the very apex of everything the Republic stood for. He was the first of his family to hold that office, what the Romans called a new man, homo novus, and he held it in the most dangerous year imaginable, the year Catiline and his conspirators planned to burn the city and begin again in blood and ash. And Cicero, armed with nothing but information and language, stopped them. He was not a soldier. He was never a general. He held a sword, it is said, only on certain ceremonial occasions and with no great enthusiasm. In a world where military glory was the currency of ultimate Roman power, where Pompey and Caesar and Crassus were reshaping the Republic with legions and gold, Cicero offered only words, and yet those words were sufficient to do what armies sometimes could not, to persuade, to shame, to illuminate, to preserve. He believed with a sincerity that was perhaps his greatest vulnerability that the Republic was worth saving with arguments rather than swords, and that a free state argued over and contested and imperfect was still infinitely preferable to a peaceful order imposed by a single will. He did not always live up to his own ideals. He was vain, we should say that plainly, vain in the way that people who have worked very hard for very long to achieve something tend to be vain, conscious of their own achievement to the point of exhaustion. His letters to his friend Atticus reveal a man who worried constantly, who second-guessed his decisions, who was capable of magnificent courage in the forum and profound anxiety in private. He made compromises he later regretted. He navigated the treacherous waters of the first triumvirate with less elegance than he would have wished. He was slow sometimes to see clearly what was happening around him, and swift sometimes to see it too clearly and be paralyzed by what he saw. He was human, in other words, thoroughly, recognizably, endearingly human, and it is perhaps that humanity, preserved so completely in his letters and his writings, that has kept him vivid for so many centuries after the world he inhabited has gone entirely to dust and silence. After his death, his hands were displayed in Rome, the hands that had written the Philippics, the speeches against Mark Antony that had sealed his fate. It was meant as a warning, a demonstration of what happened to those who chose words over deference, but it became something else instead. The story goes that even then, even in that grim display, people stopped to look, and something in them recognized what had been lost. His works survived the fall of Rome itself, traveling in manuscript through monasteries and scriptoria, copied by monks who perhaps did not fully understand the world they were preserving, but understood that the sentences were beautiful, that the arguments were careful, that something in the cadence of the Latin felt like standing near a fire on a cold night, warm and steady and alive. Petrarch, the great Italian poet of the 14th century, discovered a collection of Cicero's private letters and wept, it is said, at the revelation of so complicated and so recognizable a man beneath the marble of his public reputation. The Renaissance scholars who followed pored over his treatises and found in them a model for how a free society might speak to itself. With reason, with dignity, with the assumption that the person listening was capable of being persuaded rather than simply commanded. The founding fathers of the American Republic read him. The orators of the French Revolution quoted him, though not always wisely. School children across Europe and the Americas for centuries learned Latin from his sentences, and those sentences shaped the way they thought about argument and evidence and the obligation of the educated to speak clearly about the things that mattered. It is not too much to say that the very idea of what public speech is supposed to be, honest, structured, aimed at truth, accountable to an audience, runs in a direct and traceable line back to a boy sitting in a room above the Fabrano River, learning what language could do. And now the river is running in the darkness, as it always has, small and cold and constant, finding its way around the stones the way it has done for thousands of years, indifferent to the names of consuls and emperors, indifferent to triumph and exile and grief, carrying its quiet sound down through the valley and out toward the sea, where all waters eventually arrive and all journeys eventually rest. You have traveled a long way tonight, through a Roman boyhood and a Roman city, through courtrooms and forums, through Tusculan gardens and Athenian schoolrooms, through the smoke of conspiracy and the silence of exile, through grief and through the long, beautiful labor of a mind that could not stop thinking, even when the world grew dark around it. You have kept Cicero company for a little while, and he, I think, would have been glad of it. He liked an audience. He liked to know that someone was listening. Let the river carry the rest. Let the lamplight of all those long Roman evenings soften now into something dimmer and warmer, something that asks nothing of you, except that you close your eyes and let the words settle, slowly, like dust in a room where no one is walking anymore. Sleep well wherever in the world you are tonight. The voice has not faded, and neither, for a little while at least, have you.